Pretty good. How about you? I got back into Cheyenne last night about 11:30. So that got up this morning and drove up. It's time to start. Might need to stay. All that success. Hey, lady. Hey, good morning. Good. I'm sorry. That's all right. Hey.
Well, good morning. And with that, we'll call the meeting to order. And we have a roll call, please. Sure. Can you hear the background music? Elevator music?
Well, we don't want any smooth jazz with us.
Senator Analyst. Present. Senator Pappas. Senator Robinson. Here. Senator Rossberger. Here. Representative Bodie. Here. Representative Brown. Here. Representative Flipner.
Senator excused. She's an egg.
Representative Freeman. Here. Representative Kinner. Here. Representative Paxton. Here. Representative Keefe. Here. Representative Simpson. Here. Chairman Coe. Here. Chairman Norco.
Here. Thank you, Ted. Chairman, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Just that, as everybody can see, we have got
Okay, with that, we have approval of the minutes from the June 6th and 7th meeting.
Move for the approval. Second.
Been moved and seconded to approve the minutes. Any comments or revisions? None appearing, we'll proceed to vote. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Approve the minutes for the June 6th and 7th. That takes us up to school finance. Mr. Chairman, we're attendance as scheduled.
I'll change that.
All right. So Matt, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just some housekeeping items for everybody. This meeting is being streamed through Enterprise Technology Services. So please use your microphones, turn them on, pass them along the table, turn them off when you're not using the microphones. And that way everybody who's watching online can observe the meeting through the internet. A couple other items. I passed out a PowerPoint presentation. I'll be the first one this morning. We will pass out the additional PowerPoints as they come up, so you can put them into your notebooks. I don't want to pass them all out this morning. And so when those come up, we'll pass those out for you. With that, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'll proceed on the school financial monitoring report.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. If you recall at the June meeting, I explained some background information regarding this monitoring process. And today is the presentation of information from LSO, and then we have information that will be presented by Dr. Christiana Stoddard, and then the Department of Education. The first tab in your notebook this morning is the main report that LSO puts together, and then the presentations of the reports that are the appendices will be presented by Dr. Stoddard and the Department of Education. I will open up the discussion this morning with, again, just a little bit more background on the monitoring report. Then I'll have those presentations provided to the committee, and then I'll come back up and finalize my report. Really, the goal of this presentation and the process is for the committee to make a recommendation to the Joint Appropriations Committee by October 15th on a recommended external cost adjustment to the education district block grant model. And so that's the goal of this agenda item. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll proceed. As I mentioned in June, this process was codified in the statute in the 2012 budget session. And it's an opportunity for the committee to receive various reports and information on cost pressures associated with teacher salaries and non-teacher salaries, and then also observe cost pressures on the non-personnel items contained in the educational resource document model. There are various indicators that Dr. Stoddard will review with you in evaluating those market pressures on salaries within the education resource block grant model. And then LSO takes a little bit more of a role on the non-personnel items. The goal is to, like I said, provide this committee as much information as possible to make a recommendation to the Joint Appropriations Committee. One of the first items we have historically done is use the evidence-based model that was developed by the firm Pike Associates to monitor the level of funding that recommended model allocates or would allocate to school districts, and compare that to what we call the statutory model. On page 2 of the report, I have provided an analysis dating back to school year 2006-07 and estimating out what the funding model in the evidence-based model and the statutory model and what those comparisons of the funding levels are. If you go to the 2018-19 school year, we're about even. It's an estimated $100,000. Next school year, the estimated difference is that the evidence-based model would resource $22 million. There are some assumptions that LSO makes in comparing these. An example is the transportation specialist. Under the evidence-based model, we assume that they would fully fund 100% reimburse the allowable expenditures. As you know, the past couple sessions, the legislature has modified the transportation reimbursement component, as well as for the next 2 school years, will freeze the special education reimbursement. So based upon those assumptions, if you change those assumptions, those differences obviously would be different. The narrowing of the line, or now $22 million difference, let me kind of walk you through it as to why that has occurred. The first piece is during the 2017 session, the legislature calibrated the non-personnel items to the recommended levels of funding by Pike Associates. So that accounts for a majority of the non-personnel difference. Additionally, as part of our assumptions, we provide an external cost adjustment annually for the non-personnel items on the evidence-based model. And so in 1920, that accounts for about $7.2 million of the difference. On the personnel side, part of that decrease, $26.6 million I've estimated in 1819. And this is the third bullet on page 3 on the bottom half of the page, is in the 2014-15 and the 2015-16 sessions, the legislature provided an external cost adjustment on the personnel side of the model, or the salaries that are contained within the model. We have not removed those with an evidence-based model. We have kept those on there since those were observed as part of the recommendations of the 2015 recalibration. I've already mentioned the reimbursement. So those items combined is the reason that the narrowing and the $22 million difference estimated for the school year 2018-20. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to observe the differences on the non-personnel side. I'll stop there, and then I'll come back after the presentations and discuss the cost indices and kind of the inflation amount of the related to the personnel and non-personnel side. On page 4, and then going on to page 5, I provided a table 2 that describes the differences between each of the funding model categories for non-personnel items. In total for school year 18-19, that difference is $5.2 million. For 19-20, that is estimated to be $9.6 million. Again, really the main differences are twofold. One is the evidence-based model. Again, you observe an annual increase for 1819 and 1920 based upon the recommended cost indices. We inflated those. And then the second major difference is associated with the third line down, the short cycle performance assessment. Within the evidence-based model, we have still contained that amount of 2.3 million in there. If you recall last year, that funding was repealed because the Department of Education's contract for the statewide assessment contains those types of assessments and are being paid for by the state. So if you were to eliminate that out of the evidence-based model, the total difference would be $7.3 million for 1920, or $3 million for this school year. With that, Mr. Chairman, any questions from the committee?
Any other questions? Right, we good to go.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll then have Dr. Stoddard come out and she'll present her information. And then after her, we'll have the Department of Education go through their report as well.
Morning, Dr. Stoddard. How are you doing?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good to be here.
Good to see you again.
Let's see, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
So my report is the labor market piece of this. So this report is an analysis looking at both teaching staff, which the first half of the report I'll focus on teaching staff pretty much exclusively, and then the second half of the report we'll be looking at non-teaching staff. So as part of these comparisons, because teaching is such an important component of the staffing funds, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about teaching, comparing salaries in Wyoming with salaries in other states, comparing salaries, teaching salaries in Wyoming with salaries of other professionals in Wyoming, and then looking a little bit at recruitment and retention indicators, so that we not only just look at salaries, but also look at what's happening around recruiting and retaining quality teachers. When we go to the non-teaching position, there will mostly be a comparison. It's a little bit easier and more straightforward to compare a nurse who teaches in schools with a nurse in another with another employer, and so the second part is a little bit quicker, but a lot more positions to look at. So again, there we'll mostly be looking at comparing non-teaching positions in Wyoming with their counterparts in Wyoming, and then looking a little bit at so the first figure is just to put this kind of in context, and goes a little bit on what you've already heard, and I'm sure we'll see a little bit more later, comparing the model salary with the actual average salary. And you'll notice as we go through this report, most of what I've done is to try to present these indicators over time so that you can see trends. That's usually more useful and more informative than just looking at the current year. And so you can see that presently the model salary for teachers is about $52,000, $52,500, and that the actual average that's being paid to teachers in Wyoming is about $6,000 more than that, about 11, 12% more than that. So with that in mind, why look at these cost pressure indicators? What's the thing to sort of bear in mind when you look at that? Cost pressures, the way I conceive of them as a labor economist, is to think about forces that are causing salaries to need to be higher in order to retain or recruit the same quality of teachers into the teaching pool. So how does that quality get determined? Well, it's different for every individual teacher, right? But in general, we're thinking about college students who are trying to decide what career do I want to go into. And so they're comparing kind of their skills and interests and trying to line those up with teaching, and then thinking about other occupations. Certainly there are some teachers who are currently teaching who may be comparing other occupations as well, although previous reports have found that there's relatively little attrition in Wyoming from teaching into other professions in Wyoming. So comparing with other salaries is most salient when we're thinking about college students trying to make an occupational. So high teaching salaries are going to attract in more individuals who have better opportunities outside of teaching. So we're thinking about those as often people who have higher skills or higher abilities, more opportunities, and so the higher wages necessary to recruit them in. So that said, there's no right teacher salary. There's no magic number that I can give you, but rather this kind of trade-off between higher salaries and higher quality and lower salaries and generally a lower quality pool. So changes, that's why I said, you know, I'm not going to look at one point in time, but look at this kind of changes in context. So if we look at changes in wage opportunities in teaching in Wyoming compared to other opportunities either in other states or other job opportunities in Wyoming, that says something about the direction of cost pressures. So as a result, this report is going to combine data from a whole bunch of sources, lots of tables and graphs that we're going to go through. And I'd encourage you, because it is coming from so many different sources, to feel free to stop me at any time with questions. First, Chairman was wrapped, and I need to slow down a little, but so again, kind of looking at this with reference to teaching, we're going to look at labor market indicators. So what's happening outside of teaching in other states, what's happening outside of teaching in Wyoming. And we're also going to look at demographic indicators. So how much demand is there? We'll think about that more in the demand side. How much demand is there for new teachers due to teachers leaving or due to increasing student enrollments? And then we're going to look at these recruitment and retention. So maybe this is kind of beating a dead horse here, but just to make sure it's clear, we're going to start with these labor market indicators and do these kind of two-way comparisons. So there are 7 basic indicators that we're going to walk through here. So we're going to look at the change in the ratio of teaching wages compared to other professionals in Wyoming. So other kinds of occupations that might be relevant, decide whether or not to stay about what those comparable professionals are. So the second indicator is to look at teaching wages in Wyoming compared to wages in other states. And in particular, we're going to focus on the adjacent states. I've also pulled in North Dakota because it's also a heavy resource dependent state. And so in some years, it's been especially salient. Then we'll look at trends in recruitment and training. So where are teachers getting their training? Where are they coming from? We'll look at then the kind of the demand side, pressures that come from student enrollment, from teacher retirement, and then we'll look at these kind of turnover rates. Okay, so starting with these labor market indicators then. So the first indicator, as I mentioned, is this looking at this ratio. So how much do teachers make relative to other professional and technical occupations? So these data come from the occupational employment statistics. So those are statistics based on surveys of employers. So they're not surveys of individuals, but surveys of employers. It's done every quarter. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does these, and they survey different establishments. And so I'm looking at 2 different sets of occupations to compare. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has, lumps occupations into different groups. So the first group that I'm going to look at is all professional and technical occupations. So that's the broadest group where I think those are the most comparable. Teachers fit within that, and we think about most other kind of professional occupations or technical related occupations that would be relevant. So we're not looking at wages in manufacturing. We're not looking at wages in the service industry. We're mostly looking at professional technical occupations. And then there's also a narrower set of occupations that an outside agency has evaluated when they tried to look at really specific characteristics of teaching and then match those up with the skills and attributes of other jobs. And so I've taken their set of occupations, and that list of occupations is in the appendix of this, and just look at that kind of narrower set. So one thing to mention, because these are establishment-based statistics, I can't adjust these for age or experience of the workers. I'm just saying, here's what we're paying our workers. So they're also not adjusted for hours or weeks of work. And we know that teachers work fewer hours and fewer, and in particular, fewer weeks of work per year than non-teachers. So summers, right, are the big part of it. We also know that teachers tend to have higher benefits than many other workers, so have better health insurance packages and retirement packages. That's also not included in here. So when we think about these comparisons, you want to kind of bear that in mind and also point that out. The good thing about the occupational employment statistics is that they're very current. And so we can look at kind of the most recent quarterly data on what are people making in other occupations. And so the individual level data, and I think Dr. Taylor will speak to some of that, where you're making adjustments for experience and age and education levels, is a little bit more dated. Okay, so this next figure then is kind of the punchline on this. So there are 3 lines there. The lower line, the blue line with the triangles, shows average wages of teachers, again, as reported in these occupational employment statistics. So not from the Department of Education, but what school districts are reporting to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, although it's very close. We can see that the numbers here are only slightly different from the $58,000 that I told you before that we get from the Department of Education. You can see that those wages have remained relatively flat in recent years. So teaching wages, average teaching wages in Wyoming have stayed relatively flat. You can also see kind of what the trajectory has been compared to other occupations. So that top dark black line with the X's on it, that's the average wages of that whole group of professional and technical occupations. And so you can see that in general, they make about 15% more. So teachers make about 85% of what other professional and technical workers make. And then the red line that lies just slightly below that is this narrower set of comparable occupations. So nurses, accountants, other kinds of occupations that have characteristics that are most similar to those observed. So what we can see is kind of since about 2010, well, prior to 2010, I should say, so starting in 2003, we can see that those salaries of teachers rose pretty rapidly to kind of converge with salaries of these other occupations, and then since then have diverged as wages have been flatter in teaching relative to the kind of growth of wages in these other occupations.
Mr. Chairman.
So would you give examples of comparable occupation and professional tech? I know we've done it in the past.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so I'll point you to,
Further in the presentation.
no, sorry, I was gonna say, I'll point you to Appendix A, I can just read a couple of those if that's helpful. So what are the groups of occupations that are included within professional and technical occupations? So the first one would be management occupations, and we'll talk a little bit about management more when we get into principals and superintendent salaries. Business and financial operations occupations, computer and mathematical science occupations, architecture and engineering, life, physical, social science occupations, community and social service occupations, legal, education training, library, art, design, entertainment, sports media, and healthcare practitioner and technical occupations. So there's a wide range in here, certainly. So you've got doctors, you also have nurses within the healthcare practitioner, but you don't have technicians. So you don't have phlebotomists, for example, in there. So you have management occupations, you don't have secretarial and clerical workers in there. So does that clarify your question?
Thank you.
All right, so this next figure then looks at that ratio. So it takes the previous figure that we were looking at, takes that top line, professional and technical occupations we just went through, is the denominator, and then teaching wages is the numerator. So what's the ratio there? And like I said, you can see that that ratio rose and then fell. It has fallen as wages outside of teaching have risen and wages in teaching have been flat. And currently is at about 86%. So teachers make about 86% of what other professional and technical workers make. So that's the right ratio. To put that in context, the other two lines show what does that look like, what does that ratio look like in the United States as a whole, and then what does that ratio look like in neighboring states and also including North Dakota. So the bottom two lines, the green one with the plus signs, I think, is the United States as a whole, and you can see that that ratio is much closer to about 76, 77%. So it's a lot lower than the ratio in Wyoming, meaning that teachers in Wyoming are relatively high paid compared to other professionals. In other states, they're paid much less than other professionals. And again, that ratio is about what you might expect if you account for weeks of work. So the fact that teachers don't work during the summer would give us something on the order of 75 to 80% if you were just kind of doing a straight weeks of work adjustment. So I haven't made that adjustment. There's kind of a debate among professionals about whether that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Certainly you can think about a college student saying, well, do I want to become a teacher or not? And they might say, well, summer's off, that's great, right? Or they might say, well, lower wages, I don't know. So it depends on individual preferences, how important that time off is relative to the foregone wages. But we can certainly see that while that ratio has fallen in Wyoming, it's fallen pretty steeply in recent years, it still is pretty high compared to what that would look like.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd be curious to know, looking over your materials, and you touched on this at the beginning of your presentation about considering other benefits like health insurance. And I think one thing that's striking when you look at Appendix A is we're comparing public sector jobs to private sector jobs, where even I think you mentioned that sometimes the private sector jobs can't compete with some of the public sector benefits. I'm wondering if you have that analysis of charts that look, or that consider the value of those benefits and what that looks like, if that provides greater parity.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Ellis, unfortunately, no, it's really hard to kind of fit information in a timely manner. So there certainly are periodic surveys of establishments, but in terms of doing this kind of comparison from year to year, no. So that's why I make the point that when we look at this, it's not taking into account additional benefits. That's something we kind of but certainly I would agree with you that that's one explanation for why wages might be slightly lower in teaching than in other professions, in part because they're different hours of teaching work and also different.
Chairman, go ahead.
Yeah, all of that. So when we talk about benefits, take into consideration income tax. Look at Montana, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, they all have state income tax. But where does that factor?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, no. Right now, these are just wages as reported by the establishment. So it's really difficult to take into account income tax, but depends on the person's individual household. So we don't have that information.
Further questions? Representative Freeman.
I think that Mike is right there. I'm a former teacher, and listening to that we don't work as long and we don't have summers off, I have a red flag that I would like to throw with that. My wife just recently retired, and she made a comment the other day that it's the first time that she hasn't had to take at least 3 weeks off to go to different conferences and stuff in the rest of the summer. And frankly, most teachers, if you go to a school, you're not supposed to be there until 8. You see a lot of teachers there at 6, and you see a lot of teachers there at 5. So I understand where you're going. I understand when I first started, it was that you had June, July, and August, but that's not the reality anymore. And I just want to make a call.
Very good. Further questions? Comments? Please proceed, Dr. Stoddard.
Sure. And Mr. Chairman, just a quick response to that, Representative Freeman. I would certainly say it's the hours and weeks of work we get depend on what individuals report in other surveys. So I don't have them here. In those surveys, when people say how many hours and weeks of work they work, teachers do report working less. In part, that's due to the fact that other professional technical occupations really 3 hours a week these days as well. So there's just really increased hours of work across all of those professional technical occupations. All right, so moving on to the second indicator. So now we're thinking about where does Wyoming sit relative to other states in our region. So this data is coming from a different source here now. So this data is coming from the National Educational Association survey of state education agencies. So they survey the different states to get average teaching wages as reported by their departments of education. And so the trend here is going to reflect how attractive is Wyoming, teaching in Wyoming compared to teaching in Colorado or Utah or another state. So this chart here then that we're on that's got the 4 lines. Let me just break this down here. So the first line to look at would be the blue line. That's the one with the triangles, and that shows what average actual wages are in Wyoming. And so again, you can see wages were relatively low. There was the spike that brought wages up higher. So by 2006, you can see that that blue line is running quite closely to the top green line. So the top green line of the squares is showing average wages in the United States, so average teaching wages in the United States. And so you can see right now that wages in Wyoming are relatively close to average wages in the rest of the United States. There's been a little bit of a divergence, so a little bit of a drop relative to the rest of the United States last year. So you can see that drop at the end. Below that, those 2 lines, you can see the red dotted line there shows the model salary in Wyoming. So I just put that in there for reference. And then the line below that shows the average wages in the region here. So this is again the adjacent states adjacent to Wyoming and including North Dakota. And you can see that those wages have a similar trend line to the national wage, but they're a lot lower. So wages in our region tend to be lower than average wages. You can also see that there's kind of a run up there, that those wages have gotten higher in other states. Again in the last year. So the next slide, which I apologize is kind of messy, but if you have a favorite state that you want to compare Wyoming to, here's the slide for you. So again, Wyoming is that top line, the blue line with the triangles. And then you can see, and I won't go through each of the individual states, but you can see all of the other states in the region below that. And again, you can see there that there have been these run-ups in other states, in particular in South Dakota and in Colorado, and also in North Dakota, this kind of like spike in wages in the last year. So that's what's driving the rise in average wages in the region that we saw in the previous graph. Okay, so that tells us something about what those labor market pressures might look like. So wages in Wyoming, again, just to summarize, wages in Wyoming in teaching have fallen relative to wages of other professionals in Wyoming and have fallen over the last several years. That ratio still remains high relative to other states. Wages in Wyoming in teaching are high relative to teaching wages in other states, but we have seen an increase in wages in those other states in the last year, and we've also seen Wyoming fall a little bit relative to the national average last year. So how attractive is it then to recruit teachers from other states into Wyoming? So that's what this next slide is saying. Are we starting to see fewer teachers coming from outside of Wyoming? If Wyoming wages are high, then Wyoming's going to have an easy time recruiting high-quality teachers from other states, particularly the surrounding states, but also states further afield. And so that's what this graph shows. So there's not been a dramatic change in the percentage of new hires that got their degree from another state. I don't actually know where these people grew up. I just know where they went to college. So this is looking at new teachers over the last 5 years who got their brand new freshly minted BAs. So I'm not looking at a new hire in Wyoming who was 45 and been teaching for a while and just moved here from another state. These are newly minted BAs. Where are they getting their degrees from? And you can see that increasingly Wyoming's drawing on its own graduates in the last several years, but it's not a dramatic change. So a little bit more than half of new teachers are coming from, who have a recent BA, are coming from outside the state. The high was about 67%, and you can see that again, that was back in 2010, and that coincided with the period where wages in Wyoming were especially high compared to other states. So right now, wages in Wyoming are about 15% higher than they are in adjacent states. Previously that was as high as 25% higher. So there has been a little bit of a decline in that ratio, but it's been relatively flat over the last 4 years. The next slide shows you what are the institutions that they're coming from. So where is it that people are getting their degrees from? And this, I should note, is just for individuals where we know where their degrees from. There are some data that's missing or that wasn't reported by some school districts, so just taking the ones where we have reported data. We can see most students, that the biggest percentage, about 45%, are coming from the University of Wyoming. And then it drops off. So the next most frequent places that new hires earned their bachelor's degree are from Black Hills State University, Western State Colorado, Valley State University, and Chairmen State. So those are the most common places. And then you can see below that, there's a bar that shows about 2% where they're coming from, and then 1% from another set, and then a whole bunch of other miscellaneous institutions. So one thing to note about this chart is that, we all have our, I'm from Montana State, so I think Montana State's, pretty much the best institution on that list. And but one thing that we've tried to monitor in this process is, in particular, teachers who are getting a degree mostly from a place that has an online training program. There's been a lot of concern about the quality of some of those programs. I'm sure some are great, but there have been concerns in general about those. In previous years, we've kind of seen an uptick, I think, as for-profits really made a run at increasing enrollment, and we have not seen that in the last year or two. So that trend doesn't appear to have continued. So that's our first set of indicators then that are looking at kind of labor market pressures and how teaching compares to other areas and other occupations. The next set is now going to look at kind of the demand side. So you can think about how many cost pressures being determined from how many people are willing to teach, and then how many positions the districts need to staff. And when there are a lot of positions that districts need to staff, there are more cost pressures. So this is now looking at data from the Department of Education student enrollment numbers, and then also projections from the National Center of Education Statistics, and looking at their trends in student enrollment. So what we'll see here is that, in general, if you have rising student enrollment, you have more positions to fill, you're going to have more pressure. But what Wyoming has actually experienced in the last several years is a decline in student enrollment. So this graph was a relatively more uncomfortable one for me to put together this year because, in general, the projections from the National Center of Education Statistics track what the actual enrollment is in Wyoming pretty closely. So the way they form their projections is they look at people who are living in Wyoming right now, how many of them are 2, how many of them are 3, how many of them are 4, how many of them are 5, and then age them forward. So when they're trying to project enrollment out to the future. And so if you look at this graph, you can see that the blue line here that doesn't have any symbols on it is the actual enrollment from the Wyoming Department of Education. And then the orange line with the dots shows the National Center of Education Statistics reports actual enrollment. And then you can see the red lines moving forward are their projections. So in the past, like I said, those projections tracked pretty well. I think what's happened, though I can't say definitively, is that we've had an enrollment drop in part from people moving out of the state. So some of the enrollment drop that we're seeing is moving out of the state, and the National Center for Education Statistics, when they do their projections, they don't have any way of looking at how many more people are likely to leave the state. They're just, like I said, looking at your 2-year-olds that are going to be kindergartners in 3 years, your 3-year-olds that are going to be first grade in 3 years. So to the degree that Wyoming experiences additional people leaving the state, particularly people that have school-age children, you might see that divergence. So right now, like I said, there's been this dip in enrollment. The National Center of Education Statistics is projecting an increase in enrollment of about 1%, a little bit less than 1%, similar to what we've seen in terms of student enrollment growth in the past. So I would say definitely there's not cost pressure driven right now for increasing student enrollment, and maybe actually we're going to see more positions being shed if enrollment drops. So the next source of new positions will be teachers retiring. So student enrollment growth for teachers retiring. This was was an issue, particularly as the baby boom started to retire, although as you'll see, most of that has passed through now. And so the percentage of teachers retiring is really pretty much stabilized at this point. The next graph just shows that visually, so it's comparing the age profile of teachers in this 2017-18 year. That's the orange line with the dots, and then the blue line that's solid is looking at that about 10 years ago, 8 years ago. So you can see that, you know, previously teachers were a little bit older, that the most common age group was that 45 to 54 age group. And so there was increased pressure from retirement, but now teachers are relatively younger. So not as much pressure for retirement. The next graph kind of shows that again in a different way. So if we predict forward the number of teachers who are 60, age 60 and older, there's been a slight decline in that. All right, so kind of pulling all of that together, sort of the demand side, the supply side, we're looking next at the percentage of new hires. So how many people are districts having to hire each year? So the percentage of new hires can be related to new positions. It's also going to be related to teacher retirement, and then it's going to be related to teachers just exiting for, you know, a bunch of different reasons. And so what we'll see on this next slide is that the percentage of new hires has declined in recent years. So, so in general, there's about 10% of teachers that are new hires in each year. So new is about 10% of positions that need to be filled, and that's fallen in the last 2 years. So a little bit below average, although it's certainly nothing out of the norm. All right, so so the last kind of set of indicators here then are looking at retention rates. So if we see lots of teachers exiting teaching, particularly teachers that are new or teachers that are not close to retirement age, that might be another indicator of cost pressures. Looks like these people are leaving for jobs somewhere else, either in the state or leaving for jobs in other states. We don't know much about the quality of these people that are leaving, so I can just count how many people are leaving, and I can't tell you were these the best teachers that Wyoming was losing, or were these actually people who started teaching and discovered, wow, I'm really bad at this, I should do something else, I can't control my classroom. So some of those we might want to keep, right? Teachers that are really able and get a job somewhere else, and we really like to keep them in Wyoming. Some of that turnover is turnover that maybe we don't mind if they're not a particularly good teacher. So exit rates by themselves, again, you know, there's not a right number, but again, looking at it relative to what's happened in the past, you can see something about cost pressures. So again, a bunch of lines here. The overall exit rate is the second line from the bottom, so that's the blue line with the solid circles. Shows that the exit rate in Wyoming right now is a little above 10%, at 11%. That's up from a low in 2008 when it was closer to 7%. You can see, you know, if you squint, you can see there's been a very, very slow but steady rise in that exit rate since about 2008. And then the other lines break that out kind of by source. So the top line is the exit rate for teachers who are 60 and older. So those are retired, right? So perhaps nothing, you know, that we have much control over. Then if you look at the next line below that, so the red line with the triangles, that's showing the exit rate for teachers that with 0 to 3 years experience. So the reason I focused on teachers with 0 to 3 years experience is we know it takes about, or most of the literature says, it takes about 3 years for teachers to kind of reach their full potential. It takes a few years. I would confirm that, you know, whenever I get a new prep, it takes me about 3 years before I feel really solid in that job. And so we see the biggest gains in student achievement as teachers are reaching 3 years. And then after that, most teachers don't really, you know, increase their skills. So a high turnover rate when teachers are young is somewhat something to be relatively more concerned about, because districts are having to recruit new people and then train them up again. And so you can see again there, that rate's not changed dramatically. Although, again, kind of over the last 4 years, there's been an uptick. There's been an uptick in the turnover rate of new teachers. And then the bottom line, so the green line with the little circles, dots, shows the exit rates for experienced teachers who aren't necessarily close to retirement. So these are teachers with 4 to 20 years experience. And you can see that they're not surprisingly that's the lowest very well. Okay, so there's a lot of charts and numbers, so let me just summarize briefly. So what have we seen in general, thinking about then these cost pressures? So Wyoming teaching salaries in both, kind of in all the sources we have, so the occupational employment statistics data, in the National Education Association data, they've definitely flattened. There's been very little growth. You're probably all aware of that since 2012-13. We've seen that teaching wages have fallen in Wyoming relative to salaries of other comparable occupations, from a high of 96%, so almost parity, to the current ratio of 86%, but that ratio is still competitive with other states. That the ratio of the United States and surrounding states continues to decline to now just below 75%. We've seen that teaching wages remain competitive with other states regionally. They're about a 15% premium above the average wage in the region. But we are starting to see that other states in the region are closing that gap. So the premium's high with 26%. So teachers in Wyoming making about 26% more than comparable teachers back in 2010-11, and that premium has eroded. You can see that salaries in the model are quite close to the average in other states. So if we're trying to say, our model salaries were they competitive regionally, the model salaries lie within, 0.5% to 1% of the average salaries in Nebraska and Colorado. Model salaries are pretty high relative to South Dakota, but other states are closer. We see that the fraction of new hires coming from out of state has trended down very gradually. Currently, about 53% of newly hired teachers in Wyoming are coming from outside Wyoming. We see that teacher training programs, though, are pretty similar to past years. They don't show the rise in online programs that we saw a few years ago. And then student enrollment, as I mentioned, has fallen, and that's departing from past trends where it was growing about 1% per year. It's gone down. The fraction of teachers 16 and older has been falling, and so both of those would lead to lower pressure. So we see that right now teachers in that 34 to 44 age range are the largest age group, so not projecting high levels of retirement in the future. You see that exit rates have ticked up kind of slowly but steadily, so that, like I said, they're about 12% right now compared to the low of about 7%. Exit rates of new teachers, again, the one that we're kind of maybe most concerned about, have risen modestly, I would say, but pretty steadily over the last 3 years. So the low was about a little over 10%. Right now it's at close to 15%. Mid-career teachers, not much either.
Senator Roberts.
Dr. Stoddard, one of the questions that I have with this, and I think we talked about in the past, is the hiring side from a market demand standpoint doesn't really get captured. We hear anecdotally in conversations, I think based on the ratio about the quarterly occupational employment statistics with regard to the teacher wages and the non-teacher wages. But we hear anecdotally that several years ago, probably around 2011, there would be a tremendous number of applicants for every open position in the state of Wyoming. To open a position in Boston, have 50 or 100 applicants, and then end up getting your first choice or second choice. And then we've heard that as this ratio relative to the neighboring states has fallen, we're not able to draw as many applicants. So it's not just the hires, but the number of applicants and who you're getting to apply to the job, so that we'll have open positions that are difficult to fill, particularly in music and language and all the other harder to fill areas. But we don't see that in this data, so we don't know who we're getting in terms of the hires and in terms of the departures. And to me, that's almost the leading market question, because if you open a job, typically you'll be able to fill the job. That's just the reality of the country. But the impetus for increasing the salaries to the level where, as a ratio of our neighboring states, it was high, was the idea that we would be able to recruit from a broader labor market. And the theory then was that you'd end up with the highest quality teachers, and that would lead to desirable outcomes in education. So is there something here that we can look at as a proxy for that information? Is there a way that we can capture that better in the future? I mean, we did one informal survey, I feel like, a couple of years ago to just hear about that, but I don't think we have anything that we call yet. But do you have any thoughts on how we can be looking at that and understanding it better in the future?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, I would agree with you that that's important information to capture. So a couple of responses to that. So to correct, a number of years ago, maybe Matt can remember, maybe 5 years ago or so, we would survey, I think there was some survey data asking districts how many applicants they got for different positions and how difficult it was to fill those positions. The problem with that data was that districts were reporting that data all over the map. So some areas would report the total number, like if they had 5 elementary school positions open, they would report 100 applicants for each of those 5 positions, and others would report separately. So it's hard to tell if they have 100 applicants or 500 applicants. So if that data could be gathered in a consistent way, so that it was easy to tell really how many applicants you had per position across districts, I agree. I think that would be useful information. So presently, what we have, as I mentioned, is this information mostly about where teachers are getting their degree from. And so that's why I presented how many of these teachers are coming from out of state. And so to your point, slightly less than in the past, which I think would speak to this issue of how large is the pool, unless you think the University of Wyoming does a much better job than the others. In which case, it's not an issue. What we have not seen is a big change in what I would call the selectivity of those institutions. So one thing that I've done is kind of background, I didn't include it in here, is look at the average ACT score of students coming from the different universities. And we have not seen that really change very much. That's a really crude proxy, I think, for teacher quality. We also have information about teachers' GPAs. That's been nearly flat. So, but again, that's difficult because probably a 3.5 at one institution is something different than a 3.5 at another institution. So teacher GPAs are really constant. It doesn't look like they're coming from dramatically less selective institutions. I can say that. I mean, that looks, the kinds of institutions teachers are being drawn from looks pretty similar to in the past, except for, like I said, there's a little bit fewer from these kind of online driven universities, a little bit less from other states. But again, I would agree with you. Those are crude proxies for how deep the teaching pool is.
Go ahead, follow up. Well,
Thank you, Dr. Stoddard. Obviously, we're going to see you again next year and talk this through. So because we do it every year. So I'll ask you, if you would give that some more thought, how can we do a better job of capturing that? Is there a survey we can put together for our districts that would accurately provide data, not just accurate, but precisely, so that you can actually use that data and provide us with that type of feedback of, are we competitive from a recruitment standpoint, not just a retention standpoint? Because I do think that those are both critical factors that would be valuable to see. I think I sense a change in it. I think everybody here senses a change in it due to that decay, but being unable to quantify and understand that, I do think holds us back when we're looking at market pressures as a primary driver. So I would just ask you to give that some thought, and hopefully the next time we're having this conversation, we'll have some better ability to really look at some data.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator, I'd be happy to do that.
thank you. Matt Willmarth has a comment.
Mr. Chairman, to that point, though, that survey that Dr. Stoddard discussed at the Department of Education, the volatility in that data, we just quit collecting it because there was a report that didn't provide much data back to the community. I think 4, maybe 5 years ago, the Department of Workforce Services provided the community information or a recommendation to have a statewide recruitment system, either through PTSB or the Department of Education, that would identify statewide positions by district that were vacant, and then have an application process to be able to track applications for each of those positions. Each position would have a ID, so you could have a unique identifier for each of those positions. So that was a recommendation that didn't really go anywhere. So if that's something that the committee is interested in doing, we certainly can draft some legislation that would spearhead some of that work. So that was really the crux of the issue with that data and the recommendation from Workforce Services, and I think Dr. Stoddard agreed, was then you need a statewide recruitment, kind of like the state of Wyoming has its recruitment system, but have that for all of the school districts that then could track and quantify those results.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good idea, or at least it sounds like a good idea. So maybe hearing from districts on whether that is a good idea or if there's something we're missing would be beneficial. And I definitely understand Dr. Stoddard's concern. If you have a position where you're filling 5 slots and you're calling for 5 slots and you get 100 applicants, that's sort of different from I have 5 individual positions that are open, I can just hire it a different way, and then you've got applicants for those. So I know the source of the volatility and I understand it, but if we can think this through, hear from districts on any solutions so that we can understand this better, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Representative Kenner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment. I spent the last 2 days in Boise, and I attended the Witchy Advisory Conference, and it was very interesting to visit with legislators from the 15 Western states, and many of them all discussing these same issues about retention and recruitment and so on. And many of the legislators that border Wyoming are very tired of losing teachers to Wyoming, but they're tracking the numbers as well, and they're seeing those gaps begin to close, like you've illustrated in some of your charts. And so it was very interesting to hear about what they're doing about retention and so on, and hear about the issues that are going on. And so very real out there, and legislators are keenly aware of that, and they're trying to increase salaries in other states. We see that in the data. And so it was a very real discussion the last couple of days on all these issues. So I think it was very timely for that, and then to see the numbers and to verify all of that. Thank you. Sure.
Representative Freeman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that I think that we could track is how many empty positions are left at the end of the year. I've had, I go out into 11 different districts, and I hear a comment frequently, and we would have another person, making myself another first grade teacher if we can find one that we like. And that's fairly common in my job, and it's particularly common in special ed and psych techs and those kind of things. But I think that would give you an indication of what employment pressures are also.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Wyoming has some unique characteristics that really cause us to have some obstacles to recruiting. You know, when I was recruiting teachers and I told them I was 60 miles away from the nearest hospital and 90 miles away from the nearest Walmart, that's a factor. And when I have to hire an elementary teacher that can coach football, middle school football, that's an obstacle. I have to hire an English teacher that can teach junior high and high school with certified development. So I think, you know, I think that affects the salary. I think we have to keep our salaries fairly high in order to be competitive with other states that don't have those unique characteristics that cause us to really have to really beat the bushes on for some things. You know, to find a music teacher that's certified K-12 is not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of those kinds of things. And Wyoming has a lot of very small schools that have that very same issue when it comes to recruiting.
Questions, comments? Right, Dr. Stoddard, it's all yours.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Paxton from Montana, I can appreciate your concerns, and I believe Dr. Taylor does some work speaking to kind of the regional differences, which, you know, within the state, are really important areas that are more below higher. All right, so if there aren't any more questions about the teaching part of this, I'll turn then to looking at the non-teaching positions. So I just want to make sure we just had a chance to ask other teaching related question. So, so fortunately for non-teachers, it's a little bit more straightforward. The issue, of course, for teachers is we don't have really a comparable occupation within Wyoming to look at. Most teachers are teaching in the public schools, but when we talk about non-teachers, it's a little bit easier. So I divided this presentation rather than look at every single thing into kind of 5 groups, and we'll go through each of these in turn. So first, looking at school administration. Second, looking at the professional staff. So by that meaning licensed and certified workers, so librarians, counselors, psychologists, social workers, other kinds of administrative positions. Then we'll look at secretarial and clerical positions. Then we'll look at other classified staff, so that's mostly operations and maintenance. And then finally look at aides, which are maybe a little bit more challenging. So it's a similar kind of approach here, where again, we're going to look at the relative salaries in teaching and compare those to salaries of other professionals within the state. Most of these occupations are going to have a clear match, some of them don't. Again, kind of weeks of work vary though, and so again, that's an issue. So in the data that I used, by and large, if there are 185 contract days, that's about 37 hours of work. When we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what do they report in terms of vacation and holidays for private sector workers? It, on average, works out to about 47 weeks per year. So in some of these charts, I've given you the comparison both ways. So you can kind of look at it either the annual comparison, or if you like the weeks of weekly salary, I've divided looking at 37 weeks within schools and looking at 47 weeks outside. And then again, we're going to look at these turnover rates. So starting with administration here then, the top panel is just looking at the different positions in the model. So superintendent, assistant superintendent, business manager, principal, and assistant superintendent. The first column there shows the funding model weighted average salaries. So what does the funding model say those positions are paid? And then the column all the way to the right shows what the actual average salary is in the Department of Education files. You'll notice that these are for the year 2016-17, so not for 2017-18. And the reason for that is that when we're comparing to salaries outside of education, looking at those occupational employment statistics, the latest is May 2017. That's the latest data we have available, so that kind of goes for the 2016-17 school year. So looking at that, we can see in general that again, individuals are paid somewhat more than the model predicts. The narrowest gap there is for principals, and we'll touch on principals a couple of different times here. And then the panel below is showing comparable occupations. And again, there's not a comparable, an exactly comparable occupation to a principal. So what we're looking at first, the first row is showing all management occupations. So everything that the Bureau of Labor Statistics deems a management occupation, what is that average? So if we look at people working in the schools, in a management occupation, they're paid about $100,000 as of May 2017. The middle column there is saying, okay, what do management occupations make in the private sector? And that's about $102,000, so a little bit more. What does that look like in state and local government? There it's a little bit less. And then the rows below are trying to take a little bit of a narrower occupation. Largely that lines up with some of the other data that we've seen about. So chief executives would be where superintendents would fit. So in the OES data, they're being paid about $140,000 a year. Private industry, $164,000. The state and other local government, if we're looking at chief executives, are much closer to what we're seeing in K-12 schools. And then the next row looks at general and operations managers. The next one looking at financial managers. So in general, I would say chief executives, general and operations managers, and financial managers look like their salaries are pretty comparable to the market. So relatively close to what other state employers are paying. somewhat below private industry, especially when you're talking about chief executives. So probably not too surprising, certainly something that we've seen in the past. When we look at, though, principals, so educational administrators of elementary and secondary schools, that's what they're called in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're looking at a salary of about $95,000, and that is lower than the salary of all management occupations. And that's a change that we've seen relative to the past. So in the past, elementary school and secondary school principals were paid pretty close to, and actually there was a little bit of a premium relative to other management occupations, and now they've fallen below. And you'll see that kind of shift for principals in this next graph here, or this next table here, looking at salaries relative to the region. So again, so this is.
Representative Simpson, go ahead.
Yeah, my question about the press on the bottom there.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have a question for Dr. Stoddard. So in the last slide, if you go back, in the private sector, in my business, typical employee works 2,080 hours per year. Of these top categories, which of those, are they full-time, are they 80 hours per year, or what's a typical hourly contract amount for those categories?
And Mr. Chairman, Representative Simpson, let's see if I can add that really quickly. It is for principals, for superintendents, it's close to that, and business managers, I believe. Principals is a little less. Right away. Representative Simpson, could I get that number to you in break? I can certainly tell you it's a little less, so certainly not as many hours as what we see in the private sector. I can't put my finger on the exact number right this second. However, I would say that that was similar in previous years. So in previous years, principals were making comparable to other management occupations, and were working similar hours to what they had in the past. Now it's kind of falling below other management occupations. My guess is the hours have not changed too much, that hour comparison. But I'll certainly pull that number for you.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
So in the bottom category then, we have some that are apples to apples and some that are apples to oranges.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Simpson, absolutely. Principals are the hardest, I think, to pull an exact comparison for. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll proceed here. So the next slide now is looking at elementary and secondary school administrators, again in Wyoming, and comparing them to other states in our region. So just to make sure this is clear, the very top panel is showing the Wyoming funding model salary. So right now, the funding model salary is a little bit above about $86,500. If we look now below that middle blue bar, you'll see the actual salary. So again, the actual salary is about $95,000. And then below that, I've listed the average salary in other states. So I've provided some rank comparisons because in some years that's been helpful to people. So where do principals sit compared to other states? So principals right now, as they're actually paid, sit about 22nd, so right in the middle of other states. And if you look at other states in our region, you can see in the past, we ranked a little bit higher. So as of 2014, ranked at about 16. And that average salary that's being paid in Wyoming in 2014 of $93,000. So now I'm looking at that middle column. You can see that $93,370 is above, and by a fair margin, all of the other principal salaries in the region. If you look at the rightmost column, so as of May 2017, right now, certainly Wyoming salaries for principals are above many of the other states in the region. But you'll notice Nebraska is now edged ahead. And you'll also notice that the gap has closed, so it's a lot narrower. If we look at where model salaries sit, so again, not what principals are actually paid, but what they would be paid according to the model, there the rank for principal salaries is even lower, so it's at about 32, and that's eroded over time. So now proceeding to the next kind of model category or group here. So looking at professional staff. Professional staff here are being paid the same as teacher salary, so it's the same model salary. So the top row, again, I'm looking at that 2015-16 school year to try to do the comparisons here. And then I've given both what the average salary is, and then also given what the salary is for someone with a master's degree with 10 years experience, because many of these professionals are individuals that have a master's degree. So below then you can see the actual salaries. So again, the column on the left shows what salaries are in schools, in the middle shows what salaries are in the private sector, and then on the right shows what salaries are in state and local government. And so in each of the cells of that table, I've given both the annual salary and then below it in parentheses, the weekly salary, again, making that the weeks of work comparison, where weeks of work are higher in the private sector and for state and local government. Yeah. You can see here in general for these professionals, for school psychologists and counselors, for child, family, school social workers, also for educational, vocational, and school counselors, that salaries within schools are significantly higher than what they look like in the private sector. The comparisons kind of vary, but in general are higher than what they look like in state and local government. The bottom row there, I've just given numbers for mental health counselors, and so they're relatively comparable, even though there's not that occupation in the schools. Again, those salaries are lower relative to what we see in schools. The next table, though, you'll see a difference here. So now looking at more health-related occupations rather than these kind of counseling and psychology-related occupations. So if you look at registered nurses or at speech pathologists, both of those are showing salaries within the schools that are significantly lower than what we see looking at state and local government or looking at private sector workers. If we do the weeks comparison, then it looks a little more comparable, but at least in annual terms, there we see kind of a bigger drop in the schools. Librarians, again, look like they're relatively highly paid in schools relative to the private sector and state and local government. Network and computer system administrators, kind of low paid relative to the private sector. But again, I would say, kind of when we do the weeks of work comparison, and then they look cool. So moving to the next category now, we're looking at secretarial and clerical staff. So similar kind of comparison. So looking at the funding model average on the top, then below that, what these workers are actually paid, and you can see again, paid a little bit more than the model, but not much. So it's a much smaller premium for secretarial and clerical staff than we see for teachers and administrators. When we look at particular categories here where we can look at comparisons within the private sector and state and other local government. So again, these are using the occupational titles in the Occupational and Employment Statistics Survey. Here again, we see that these positions are relatively high paid compared to the private sector and state and local government, especially if we do this weeks of work comparison. If we look at office clerks, that's the one occupation that kind of jumps out as being a little bit lower or than in both other sectors. All right, and then one more category here. So now moving on to other classified staff. So other classified staff paid about $3,000, about 10% more than the model would predict. One thing that's a little bit difficult in looking at these is that many school districts contract out for certain kinds of services. And so the kinds of people that are on full-time as maintenance and repair workers within schools might be different than in the private sector. So the kinds of jobs that get contracted out versus the ones that don't. So within the schools, again, we can see that those professions are relatively high paid compared to the private sector workers. I'll again note there may be a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. And again, that's particularly true when we look at occupations where the weeks of work vary. So janitors and cleaners, you'll notice I don't have a weeks of work there, and that's because again, those are kind of year contracts. Although there may still be some variation. All right, and then the last category is, again, kind of a complicated one where we've got a lot of apples and orange comparisons here, and that's looking at aides, because again, there aren't exact comparisons to teaching aides in other professions. So teaching aides right now are paid about $3,000 more than the model predicts. So again, something of a premium, but not as big as we saw for administrators and teachers. So teaching assistants in the private sector are probably kind of a different animal. It looks like K-12 teaching assistants, so that would be the title where most of these agents show up, are paid a lot more than what districts are reporting for their aides. So I don't think that the district category, the category that we use in the Department of Education files, and here the occupational employment statistics category line up very well. So it's really, this is one where it's kind of difficult to tell exactly what's going on. So certainly you can see that the district average actual salary of $23,000 is lower than a teaching assistant in the private sector. It's also lower than what's being reported in K-12 schools. And then the bottom panel there just shows other service occupations that might be similar kinds of skill level work. So we have childcare workers, personal and home care aides, and healthcare support occupations. So like we did with teachers, the next thing we're going to look at is turnover rates. So again, if we see kind of a rise in turnover rates, that might be evidence of more cost pressures, particularly for these workers, because these are workers where there are more parallel occupations for them to transition out of working in the schools to another employer. So what I'm not going to do is count somebody as an exit if they're employed in the same district in the same occupational class. And that sounds like a no-brainer, but I want to be clear here. So I gave this example of Jane. So Jane's an assistant principal. If next year she becomes a teacher, so she switches occupations, then that would be counted as an exit. That principal exited a different occupation. If next year she becomes a principal, so she's within that administrator category, I'm not counting that as an exit. So I hope that's sufficiently clear. So this next one here, this next chart looks at then those exit rates across these different occupations here, and I put kind of all the occupations together at once so you can kind of see. Not surprisingly, you'll notice that the highest exit rates are going to be for aides. So that group has the highest turnover rate. Next below that would be other classified staff. You'll see that the lowest exit rate tends to be for administrators, or the blue triangle, and office support, which is the green line. Although other professionals are kind of down there as well. And so these next ones are going to break that out. So just like we did with teachers, I'm going to show for each of these the overall exit rate and then the exit rate for people newly in that position. So people with 0 to 3 years experience in that position. So this would be, kind of accumulated experience as an administrator, not accumulated experience if you were a teacher before and then became an administrator. So, so here you can see that there's really pretty low turnover, as we saw for administrators, and that's true for new administrators as well. So obviously new, there are fewer people, so that bounces around a little bit more. But I would say in general, those are low exit rates, around 10%. And relatively flat, maybe again, if you split, there's a slight rise since 2008. If we look at professional staff, there we can see more of a trend. So for professional staff, we see that both for the statewide average and also a little bit for less experienced professional staff, we see that there has been a slow and steady rise in exit rates. So again, we're thinking about school nurses, psychologists, counselors, that group of professionals, computer technicians. So a somewhat of an increase in exit rates. For secretary and clerical workers, again, it's noisy. these people stay in these positions below us. We don't have a lot of new hires, but if you look at the overall average, so the blue line at the bottom, again, you can see a rise in exit rates for secretaries and clerical workers since about 2008. For other classified staff, same story, kind of a general, slow rise. And for supervisory aides, again, that was the group that had the highest exit rates. You can certainly see for new aides, so ones with 0 to 3 years experience, there's definitely been a marked, I would say, increase in turnover rates. However, kind of the last slide, just to put this in context, says, all occupations have some turnover. So how do those turnover rates that we were seeing there, how do they compare with turnover rates in the private sector? So I can't drill down to the occupational level here because that's starting to get too fine to make comparisons. So this is looking, and this is work from the Department of Workforce Services, looking at turnover rates by industry. So the top row there is educational services, mostly K through 12 schools, but what private schools there are in Wyoming would also be included in that, as would universities and colleges within Wyoming. So we can see the turnover rate there is 12%. That's right in line with the kinds of figures that I can show. A turnover rate of 12% today, so in the first quarter of 2017, and also when we look at the first quarters from 2010 through 2016, we don't really see much of a change within the educational services industry. And then when you look below that, you can see that nearly all of these other industries have higher turnover rates. In the private sector, you tend to have much higher turnover rates. The one that looks like education is public administration down the bottom. So that's not, I think, too surprising. And again, among other public employers, you see pretty low turnover rates. So here's my final kind of summary of what we just went through. Then looking at non-teaching staff, what the cost pressures look like. So for administrators, we see kind of a 20 to 24% premium above the model. So they're actually being paid, most administrators are being paid somewhere between 20 and 24% higher than the model, except for principals. Principals are about 11%, so a smaller premium. I would say in general for administrators, it's a little bit below market. Although, as Representative Simpson noted, there's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison here. Principal salaries, I would say, are now similar to the region in that there's not much of a premium, or not as much of a premium as there was in the past. For psychologists, counselors, social workers, and librarians, there we're seeing both a premium relative to the model and a premium relative to the market. So relatively well paid, relatively low turnover. For nurses, I would say healthcare professionals are the exception to that. So of the professional staff, nurses are paid more in line with the model and are below market. If we look at annual wages, but if we look at weekly wages, then they're in line. For secretarial and clerical workers, for operations and maintenance, and for aides, we're not seeing as much of a premium for salaries relative to the model, so it's more than 15% of a premium. As you can see, secretary and clerical workers look pretty much in line with the market, operations and maintenance somewhat above market, aides perhaps somewhat above market, although, again, the information there is a little bit noisier. But for all of those groups, we can see that there's been an increase in turnover. So not a huge increase, not a large increase relative to other industries, but definitely statistically significant. So just to summarize that quickly, average salary, actual salary is higher than the model, more in line with the market. Weeks worked, as we've noted, are lower in schools. And so the premium relative to the market can be pretty significant if you're looking at weekly wages. I would say aides and professional staff have experienced these rising turnover rates since 2008, especially for new aides, but the turnover in education is still lower compared to other industries, similar to that in public administration. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take any other questions from committee members.
Questions for Dr. Stoddard? Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did you look at all at the that's the pressure to, control systems, how that has an effect on, and maybe the number of teacher grades and different.
Mr. Chairman, I missed the first part of your question.
Have you looked at the effect of the cuts that the legislature has made towards K-12 education in addition to the reduction in the number of students?
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, again, what I've mostly looked at is what are districts actually paying. So whatever districts are reporting that they're paying, I'm showing that, but that's why in some cases I tried to put in the model salaries, so you can kind of see where the model stacks up compared to market, not just what districts are paying compared to market. I'm not sure if that answers your question. That's what I've got for you.
And that's fine, I know how hard it would be to document that. So that's some of the, as I look at the numbers, I say, well, okay, here's some of what's going on. Some districts have cut hours for people, and that's another reason why they've moved on. There's a lot of explanations on why the turnover is increasing.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, right now I presented these numbers for full-time and part-time workers together. I have done the analysis separately for part-time versus full-time, and you definitely do see higher turnover rates among part-time workers. So I think that speaks a little bit to your question about the hours being cut and if that could be a contributor.
Other questions? Any other questions, Dr. Stoddard? Dr. Stoddard, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We go on now, Matt. Let's see, we go to Mr. Morrow and Trent, Carroll. Thank you, that's a great presentation. Please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Megan Dagan, Elder with the Department of Education. And also with me from the department, Martin Morrow, the Foundation Program Supervisor, and Trent, Carroll, the Finance Director. Ms. Morrow will walk through the continued review of educational resources in Wyoming report. And while she is not new to the department, she is new to the position. I welcome her the committee. I will note that this is a preliminary report, and the final report will be available in October.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I was fortunate enough to work with you guys before you left the department for 5.5 years. My background was pretty working as a business manager and Nebraska. I look forward to it. Okay. The continued review of educational resources in Wyoming for crew report provides a comparative analysis of model generated resources, actual staffing and expenditure data submitted by school districts. Please note that the 17-18 expenditure data is preliminary, and a full copy of the crew report will be available on our website in October. A little bit of background, in 2007 and 2008, Icahn and Associates provided the legislature with a snapshot look at the use of resources in Wyoming. Since the crew report has expanded the original analysis.
Before we proceed, in your binder, right after the green, if you're looking for right after the green page here, right where
No problem. It's stating that since the crew report was originally prepared, it's been expanded to provide a historical look at resource allocation. The WDE collaborates with LSO, School Finance Data Advisory Group, and school districts to produce the report. We can move on to slide number 3. Contained in the crew report includes average daily membership, or ADM, student demographics, staffing, class sizes, salaries and expenditures. Slide number 4. The first component I'd like to review is ADM. In the most recent year, ADM has started to decrease slightly. If you recall during last session, the method in which model ADM was calculated changed. It's now the greater of the 3-year district average or the prior school year ADM. This is why if you look at the 3-year average ADM in purple against the prior year ADM in orange, those numbers are converging. Slide number 6. The number of schools has remained fairly consistent with a small increase during 2015-16 and 16-17 only to fall slightly during most recent school year. Slide number 7. The statewide student demographic slide shows English learners in orange, special education students in green, and free and reduced fund students in blue as a percent of total enrollment. Slide number 8. This slide shows the number of Wyoming K-12 students served under Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, as a percent of total enrollment. We have listed the national ratio of students served under IDEA for comparison. Please note that the national rate includes students ages 3 through 21, while Wyoming's numbers include K through 12 students. Slide number 9. The funding model allocates additional resources to school districts for at-risk students. An at-risk proxy is determined by the unduplicated count of students designated as English learners, free and reduced fund students, and mobile students in grades 6 through 12. The at-risk proxy funds additional resources for certified tutors, EL teachers, pupil support, and summer school extended day programs. As you can see, Wyoming's at-risk count has dropped slightly compared to last year, which could be due to the decrease in total enrollment in the state. Slide number 10. We'll move on to the staffing analysis. The purpose of this section is to provide the committee with actual staffing patterns compared to the model. The WDE has worked closely with stakeholders to refine and improve data collection and reporting methods utilized by the crew report. As you recall, average daily membership, or ADM, generates resources into full-time equivalent positions or FTE. Slide number 11. This slide shows model-funded teachers at almost 7,000, while districts employ just under 6,000, for a difference of 1,055.9. Slide number 12. Let's look at librarians. Model provided 288.8 FTE, while districts employed 86.4 FTE. A difference of 202.4. Slide number 13. Library and media staff, the model funded 138.3 FTE, while districts employed 354.6 FTE, or 216.2 more FTE than the model provided. Slide number 14. Certified tutors. The model provided 390.5 FTE, while districts employed 163.8 FTE. Slide number 16. School secretaries and slide 15. Model provided 651.2 FTE, while districts employed 770.4 FTE, or approximately 39.4 FTE. Now slide number 16. School secretaries and clericals. The model provided approximately 719.8 FTE, while districts employed 584.8 FTE, or 635 fewer than the model. Slide number 17. Instructional facilitators. During the 17-18 school year, the model funded 247.2 FTE, positions and districts employed 154.3, or 92.9 fewer FTE. Slide number 18, central office administrators. The model funded 285.3 FTE and districts employed 295.2 FTE. Slide number 19, central office clerical. The model funded 325 FTE and districts employed 342.6 FTE, approximately 18.6 more FTE. Slide number 20. Mr. Chairman, now we'll take a look at salaries. As you know, staff FTEs generated from ABM are multiplied by each staffing category's average compensation amount. Average compensation is computed for each district based on education. Slide 21. The average teacher salary in 2017 was $58,406, while the funding watch model average weighted salary was $52,535. Slide 22. Superintendent, the average salary was $137,043, while the funding model weighted average salary was $112,000. Principals, the average salary was $95,810, while the funding model weighted average salary was $85,059. Slide 24. Business managers, average salary was $95,121, while the model weighted average salary was $76,472. Slide 25. Library media staff. The average salary was $52,256, while the funding model weighted average salary was $47,451. Slide 26. Secretary clerk. Average salary was $35,202, while the funding model weighted average salary was $32,201. Slide 27. Finally, the last salary slide includes information about age. The average salary was $23,731, while the funding model weighted average salary was $19,719. Going on to slide 28. The next component of our review is class size. Data contained within the crew report reflects district efforts to student-teacher ratio, while the model resource is 15:1 student-teacher ratio for elementary grades. The class size calculations contained within the crew report reflect a wider scope based on model categories. We move on to slide 29. This slide shows that historical class size is based on type of school. Since a portion of Wyoming Statute 21-13-301 was repealed in 2017, districts are no longer required to ask for a waiver for not meeting the average student-teacher ratio of 16:1 for any grades K through 3. Moving on to slide 30. The next slide shows only elementary schools based on size in comparison to the 16:1 student-teacher ratio line in red. Slide 31. Mr. Chairman, the next slide section would like to review the financial analysis section. Slide 32. The expenditure analysis of the crew provides a comparison of model-generated non-staff resources to districts. Again, I'll remind you that 2017-18 expenditures are based on preliminary. Final numbers will be examined afterwards. Moving on to slide 33. And then look at operations and maintenance. This category includes both staff costs and supplies and materials. A separate analysis is provided in the full crew report that disaggregates compensation, supplies, and materials. Looking at this slide, the funding model resource districts almost $103.6 million, while districts spend a little over $95.4 million. 534, utilities. The model resource almost 32.4 million for utilities, while district spent approximately 36 million. 535, technology and supplies. For reporting, instructional supplies and materials, and technology equipment have been combined into one category. The model resource almost $41.5 million to district for technology and supplies, while district spent a little over $51.7 million. Slide 36, central office. The model resource almost $34.4 million to districts for central office supplies and costs, while districts spent approximately $33.9 million. Student activities. The model resource a little more than $30 million to districts for student activities, while districts spent just over $41 million. Slide number 38. Professional development. Model resource almost $11.4 million to districts for professional development, while districts spent approximately $7.9 million. Slide 39. Assessment. Pursuant to Wyoming federal laws, chapter 137, last year, the funding for assessment has been repealed in the model and is now covered through the statewide assessment plan. However, reviewing last year's numbers, the model resource districts over $2.3 million for assessment expenses, and district spent almost $1.3 million. Moving on to slide 40. Vocational education supplies and equipment. The model resource over $2.9 million to districts for voc ed equipment, while districts spent almost $1.8 million. Moving on to the 541, reimbursable expenditures. And that one just goes like page 2. Special education. This slide includes personnel, out-of-district placements, and equipment. For 2018-19, the preliminary funding of $244,514,184 increased approximately 2.5% over the current year. This represents about 16.6% of the total dollar guarantee. As a result of the 2018 budget bill, provided to school districts for special education in fiscal year 1920, 2021, will be limited to the amount reimbursed to districts in 1819. An additional $2 million has been appropriated to the WD for added district placements that exceed the limitation. There will be additional information on this provided later in the agenda regarding special education. Slide 43, transportation. Again, the slide includes personnel, purchase fleet, and equipment. Isolation and maintenance has also been included through this transportation slide. For 2018-19, the preliminary funding of $89,198,063 decreased approximately 6.4% from the prior year. This amount represents approximately 6.1% of the total model guarantee. If you recall, in 2018-19, transportation operations and maintenance funding was based on the 3-year average of reimbursement received in 2014-15, 2015-16, and 2016-17. Again, more information will be provided later in the agenda regarding now, the last slide 44, other reimbursement. This includes teacher extra compensation amount for Morrow assignments, tuition payments from non-unified school districts, and out-of-state tuition payments made outside of Morrow. Small amounts estimated for the 18-19 funding have increased over the prior year to $1,973,264. The proportion of this to the total model guarantee remains very small at 21%. That concludes my report, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to answer any questions.
Do you have any questions for Kim?
None appearing, thank you very much. We're gonna take a break. We're gonna call it at 10:30 real time. We're gonna start back up. Thank you.
Testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3.
Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Well, true to form, we're only about 7 minutes off our scheduled time, so. So we'll get fired back up. Matt Willmarth's got the next presentation. So Matt, take it away, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This will just tie up the portion of the presentation from myself, Dr. Stoddard, and the Department of Education. I will direct you to page 6 of the monitoring report. So the first tab in the notebook, that first report in there. I'll give you a few seconds to go to page 6. So again, Mr. Chairman and members, the first tab in the notebook, that first 6 pages in, the title of the page, or the heading on the page, is external cost adjustment. The other piece of the monitoring process that consultants have provided the committee is a set of recommended cost indices to inflate or adjust the model for inflation. I'm getting a little feedback here.
Looking for a mic that's on. Mic on.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Sorry about that. Dr. Taylor, who's here, she'll be speaking on the Hedonic Wage Index, but she, in the 2015 recalibration effort and in the 2010 or 2012 monitoring process that got codified in law, recommended a set of cost indices for the funding model. The funding model is separated into 4 categories. The first being professional staff, the second being non-professional staff, the third being utilities, and the fourth being materials. And the recommended cost index is for professional labor is the comparable wage index for Wyoming, which is an inflation measure on the change in salaries for comparable wage workers that Dr. Stoddard spoke to earlier this morning. The same thing is for the non-professional staff. There's a comparable inflation index that Dr. Taylor calculates that measures that same inflation for those workers. On the utilities, LSO calculates this on recommended cost indices that Dr. Taylor has provided from the BLS, which is the producer price indices for commercial electric power, commercial natural gas, and gasoline. And I've provided those weights for those indices. And then the final piece is the materials index, which is the producer price index of office supplies and accessories. So how this information is then utilized within the monitoring process is that LSO, as I spoke to earlier, inflates the evidence-based models non-personnel amounts by those cost indices annually, since those are the recommended cost amounts, and we account for inflation until the next recalibration. The salaries is a little bit more nuanced in that there are many more indicators and cost pressures that have evolved. And so we really don't adjust those salaries within the evidence-based model by those. But if the legislature would like to look at what the inflation amounts on those categories are, these are the recommended indices to use. You don't have to use these. You can make your own judgment on any inflation amount. The two categories, utilities, materials, if you look in table 4, the last row there, 2019-20, the data from the BLS is not finalized yet. It's still preliminary. And so the percentages in education materials columns in the utility columns are still preliminary, and they will be finalized sometime in November. So if you do want to inflate the non-personnel items within these index, I would recommend to just have a little bit of flexibility in the recommendation that these could be further adjusted once the BLS data is finalized. So, Mr. Chairman,
So, Matt, if I understand that, we have to come up with a recommendation for JAC for an ECA, but we won't see the really relevant numbers you're talking about until November. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, what I'll say is that the BLS data for the education materials and utilities is not finalized. It is preliminary. It could change. It could not change. What I would say is if you want to inflate these, I can provide you an estimate of what that, if you want to use these for the non-personnel pieces, we're about it'd be about $7.2 million for next school year. On the professional staff, this is the committee's recommendation. You could, in Dr. Stoddard's report, she points to the principles where both the model salary and the actual salaries are less competitive than the surrounding states. And so if you want to target principals or you want to target teachers only, you have the ability within your funding model to target specific categories or model components within those categories. So it's the committee's will on how they want to do that. But then you could choose whether or not you want to inflate at 1.4% or 1.5% for the non-professional positions. You can do those categories in whole, or you could go to a specific staffing category as well. But that is the will of the committee on how they want to proceed. So, Mr. Chairman, like I said, the recommendation from this committee goes to the Joint Appropriations Committee no later than October 15th, and I'll let you guys direct on how you guys want to forward that recommendation.
Mr. Chairman and I have discussed that, and we would like to have the committee look at an ECA and talk about it amongst ourselves. And then tomorrow morning, we're going to come back with an ECA recommendation. How's that?
Or maybe not a recommendation.
Or not, but whatever we're going to do. Yeah.
So committee, everybody be thinking on this thing tonight into tomorrow, and we're going to take it up first thing in the morning, an ECA recommendation.
Sam Freeman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have we had any recommendations from staff on what an ECA should be?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a recommendation. I mean, that's not my role here. My role is to provide you guys the information on I have provided you the convergence of what the evidence-based model provides, what their funding level of an adequate level of education is. For school year 1920, the legislative model or the statutory model is approximately going to be $22 million less, but that, has various assumptions built into that. I don't have much of a recommendation to that. What I'll say is if you want to adjust these, your consultants have provided cost indices to look at the inflation amounts for each of those model categories. But you guys can change that or diverge from that. These are just some guiding posts of what has historically been provided to you, and this committee is in the role to make that recommendation.
Further questions from committee? Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, I don't want us to forget where we are. We just came out of Cheyenne last March, and maybe this is a question for Don Richard or somebody else that into the numbers, but the shortfall that still exists in K-12 funding, I think, is somewhere around $200 million a year. Is that a correct number?
Mr. Chairman, it was slightly larger coming out of the session, about $300 million a year. But that assumes, this capital construction built into that number as well. So operations is slightly less without capital construction in that, but those numbers will be updated after the October CRAIG is released, and that'll be sometime in November. We will extend those revenue shortfall forecasts for this current biennium and then going forward. I would remind the committee, the LSRA right now is your backstop, which has about $1.6, $1.7 billion in there. Once it goes below $500 million, it is no longer the backstop. But regardless of the funding source, this process here just identifies what the evidence-based model determines as the adequate level of funding, compares that to the statutory model, and then you guys can make your recommendation on how you want to proceed on an external cost adjustment.
Mr. Chairman, I just bring it up because it's all part of the discussion. And I think we need to take that into consideration when we have this discussion. Because the money's got to come from somewhere, depending on what we do. So,
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Freeman, go ahead.
Do we know when the CRAIG report is going to come out?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it will be released at the Joint Appropriations Committee, which meets October 24th and 25th in Thermopolis. I anticipate it'll be the first day of that meeting, but that agenda hasn't been finalized yet. But expect it that week, it'll be released.
Paul?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So the way that I read this, we're projected to have a $22 million deficit from the evidence-based model. What would an ECA, just to bring that up to even, what would that look like? What would be the appropriate language?
Mr. Chairman, it's a little bit twofold. One is the 1920 amount for the evidence-based model already assumes an ECA for the non-personnel. So if you were to follow the recommended amounts for the inflation factors for utilities and supplies materials for the past 2 years, that would decrease that $22 million by about maybe $9.2 million. On the personnel side, it's a little bit more tricky in that the ECAs that the legislature provided in school years 2014-15 and 15-16 are already considered or already inside the evidence-based model. If you were to provide an ECA equivalent to what's already contained in the evidence-based model, there's some judgment that LSO has to assume, or an assumption that LSO has to assume, that if you provide an ECA to the legislative model or the statutory model, does then that get compounded into the statutory model? We'll have to use some judgment on that, or provide an assumption with and without that going into the evidence-based model. If you were to provide that, the same ECAs that are currently in the evidence-based model, and then increase by the recommended adjustment or the recommended index in the table, 1.4%. If you're going beyond that, I don't know that we would go beyond what the 1.4% is. So there are various assumptions that would have to be made, or judgment had to be provided to the committee. I can't answer it.
Further questions for Matt? All right. Thank you, Matt. You're absolutely right. We need to move to public comment.
On the entire section.
On the entire section. Everything this morning.
Probably no concerns.
There is none.
No,
They're happy.
everybody's fine.
Thank you.
Right away, we got the A-team up there. The A-team
Yeah, the
up there
A-team,
right away.
Morning, Mr. Co-Chairs and members.
Mike on.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Now the green's lit. Good morning, Mr. Co-Chairs, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide public comment this morning. My name is Alex Ayers. I'm the superintendent of Campbell County Schools. And this morning, I'm representing, along with others, the ECA coalition that's made up of 12 school districts here in Wyoming. And those 12 districts are Albany, Campbell, Carbon, Johnson, Laramie, Lincoln 1, Sheridan 1 and 3, Sublet 1, Sweetwater 1 and 2, and Teton County. Currently at the table, we have Dr. Boyd Brown from Laramie 1, Mr. Don Deely, who represents Campbell as well, and Donna Little-Como from Sweetwater 2. I believe the document we'd like passed out has been distributed both to the committee, the staff, and the audience. Our coalition's attorneys, Richard Bush and O'Kelly Pearson, have written a white paper that we'd like to be part of the official record. And it was delivered to the state's Special Assistant Attorney General Mike O'Donnell on around September 5th. This 11-page white paper effectively outlines the position of the coalition, and in conclusion, represents a request that the legislature adopt an ECA for the 1920 school year that's in line with the 4 indices that have been adopted to protect districts against the effects of inflation. The districts further request that the legislature apply an ECA on a cumulative basis going forward as required. We certainly understand that you have a heavy agenda and time is tight, so I'll be brief, as will the other 3 that are part of today's presentation. So I just have 3 quick points to pull from that document. The first being that the lack of a consistent ECA application has led to the steady erosion of districts' purchasing power and a model that is no longer cost-based. Number 2, ECAs are critical to the long-term viability of any cost-based funding recommendation. And number 3, that we remember that ECAs are meant to do nothing more than maintain the status quo of districts between recalibration by adjusting to provide for the effects of inflation. Those are my comments this morning, and I'll pass the mic to Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Ayers. Thank you to the committee. Mr. Chairman, I just want to talk a little bit about the monitoring process. As we talked about it this morning, the monitoring process started when there was a belief that the legislative model was more than the Picus and Auden recommended model, and we were looking for some convergence. Currently, the legislative model is below the Picus and Auden model and the APA recommendation from last year. We do appreciate that utilities and materials have been inflated over the years with an external cost adjustment on a more regular basis, but professional and non-professional labor have not been adjusted for inflation. Labor market conditions and inflation are unrelated. Labor market conditions are a function of how local school districts choose to spend the block grant. The model salary is on average about $6,000 less than the average statewide teacher salary, which we heard this morning. And the Wyoming average teacher salary is within $2,000 of the US salary. But again, monitoring where that's at has nothing to do with the inflation. And I'll keep my comments to that. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Deely.
Thank you, Co-Chairman Northrup, Co-Chairman Coe, members of the Joint Education Committee. I'm going to speak briefly about a theory called the cost escalator theory. Back in the 2017 interim, this phrase began being used to describe the components of the model that it was claimed automatically drive up costs each and every year. The theory seems to be that due to these cost escalators, the legislature really has not cut funding to education over the past 3 sessions, that these variable components actually continually drive up the cost of education. And I'm here to tell you that as of the data available for the most current year, we can see that that definitely is false. It is not true. I would take you to the document presented first on your agenda this morning by Mr. Willmarth of the LSO, page 2. On that document is a table, and if you could go to the statutory model column for school year 2016-2017, you will see that the statutory model spent $1,512,000,000 on K-12 education. If you will look on the following year, 2017-18, which was just completed in June, that the total spending fell to $1,482,000,000, a cut of approximately $30 million. That is a 2% reduction in school spending in 1 year. In the 2 following years under the statutory model, Mr. Willmarth has estimated some, minor increases year over year. Although none of us have a crystal ball, I believe that those are a little high, and over the next 2 years, funding will actually decrease, and here's why. Enrollments throughout the state are really stagnant. They're not growing. There are phased-in cuts passed in 2017 and in the 2018 session that are just now taking place. One of those was to reduce the instructional facilitator funding down to 50% of what it was 2 years ago. The other is a change in how students are counted. Prior to the 2018 legislation, districts could count students, whether their most current year's enrollment or past 3 years enrollment, school by school was higher, beginning in the current year. That is now the entire district, whether the entire district was higher or lower the past 3 years or the past 1 year. They can get the greater of those. That is going to cut funding. To get right down to it, my estimate, if you would go to estimated 2018-19, would be $1,472,000,000 for that year. And the year after, I'm estimating in 2019-20, $1,460,000 to $462,000,000. So let's just call that $1,462,000,000 in 1920. If you compare that to the 2016-17 year, which is the highest, that's $50 million less than the funding would be than 4 years prior. If you would compare that number to the estimated evidence-based model, now we're talking $60 million, $60 million less than the evidence-based model in that year. That means basically, if my estimates are correct, by 1920, the funding, actual funding will be 4% less than the evidence-based model requires. So basically, before you, right now, you have proof that this theory of escalator, that regardless of what cuts that you make, funding for education keeps going up and up based on different factors. That is false, and the information here backs that up. Thank you. I would take any questions, otherwise I'll move the mic down.
Good morning, co-chairman, members of the committee. My name is Donna Little-Como. I'm the superintendent in Sweetwater 2. I want to talk about what's happened to Sweetwater 2 over the last 5 years. I think because of a lack of a consistent ECA and adjusting for cost, we are in a tough spot. Our purchasing power has eroded to the lowest that it's been in the 13 years I've been there. We have lost 45 teachers in Sweetwater 2. We have closed an elementary school. We have eliminated all librarians except for one to serve the entire district. We have reduced instructional facilitators. We have reduced paraprofessionals. My budget is now 78% only spent on staff. Usually that's around 85 in a district because we are in a tough spot. I cannot hire a custodian. Central office has been cleaning our office for 6 weeks now, and that includes all the parts of the office. And instead of me coaching principals, I'm vacuuming floors. I'm not sleeping at night. I cannot hire skilled laborers. I put a study together through a firm in Oregon, and I just got that study back yesterday on skilled laborers. They look at the current reality in my area, and I think one of the challenges for you all, and it's always hard for me to understand as well, when we get market pressures that aren't specific to our area and they're 2 years old, it doesn't address the reality that we're living now. I have Trona mines out my back door. I cannot hire a plumber. I had one for 80 days. He left 2 weeks ago, and his wages were increased almost 2/3 when he went to the mines. The market study that came back said that I'm not even paying near the minimum range in my area, and that's why I'm having a hard time hiring plumbers, electricians, carpenters, other people, professionals we need. I cannot hire custodians, as I mentioned. The governor of Utah, which is a competing force for us, has now committed formally about an additional infusion into teacher salaries in Utah. We're 2 hours away from Utah. That's a pressure. I cannot hire, I do not have a full staff of technology network people. I have raised the staff salary in technology a little bit, as much as I could, but I still have 2 open positions. Trump's tariffs kick in on Monday, October 1st. I'm in the middle of trying to put together a project, I've got a couple of rooms that absolutely need carpet. I have been told that that will go up between 10 and 25% due to the tariffs, because a lot of the carpet that comes here is made in China and they're paying all of that. I don't know what else to do. I'm not sleeping. We cannot continue to educate kids and people not understand that the erosion of our purchasing power over the last 5 years has an exponential effect on what's happening with Wyoming's kids in our district. I have cut a curriculum director. I have cut an assistant business manager. I have cut assistant principals. I'm as lean as I possibly can without doing harm to children. So I ask you, as you consider what to do, look at the historical history of what's happening to schools. It's not a year by year. We have tightened the belt. You ask us to do that. One thing that I did this last year that I think is positive, we can't hire, as you know, and I've spoke about this before, school psychologists, speech language pathologists, and special ed. That's been a problem for a while. The school we closed, I leased that building to Region 5 BOCES, and they operate a day program there. And I asked them, is there a way you can put together a group of professionals that we can contract so that we can get speech and language pathologist services to special education children that need them? And so we've done that, and that will help Sweetwater 1, Sweetwater 2, Lyman, Mountain View, and other surrounding districts, because we can all, that's a way to conserve and still provide some special education services. But you have to help. Our kids need you, and I don't know what else to do. I bet there's not another district in this state that staffing costs is down below 78%. I've done it from top to bottom, but I can't do it anymore. I don't mind vacuuming. I know how to do that in my own house, but this is getting ridiculous. We just can't hire people in Sweetwater County. And the costs there, the housing costs are high. I've got teachers tripled up in apartments. I don't know what else to do. I mean, when they infuse, last year, one of the things I noticed that was different than the years past was teachers that left were primarily teachers that retired over the years. But my experience went up because now I'm losing younger teachers because they're going to the markets that are paying better. So I just ask you to look at the data carefully. Consider the fact that we're looking at real data, not data that's 2 years old. That just doesn't help us with the reality I'm living today. Thank you very much.
Okay, Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Donna, I'll start with you on this, but I'm curious, kind of the same questions from the other districts, and it gets at the discussion we had before about we don't have solid data at this point in time with regard to what you're talking about that's recent in terms of your applicant pools and how many jobs you have open, how long it takes to fill them. We have some glimpses at departures, but I don't think we've got the granularity that you're discussing where we've got more about reasons for departure. Can you talk a little bit more about, 5 years ago, we weren't having this conversation. So today versus 5 years ago, can you give us a little bit of a comparison of how different things are since we started constraining the budget with your recruitment ability and your ability to retain teachers? And then the other question I have for you, which I'll ask each district, is how much short are you? I mean, we've had a series of years where we haven't given what we consider to be the full ECA. And we see the convergence in the report that LSO provided us where statutory and evidence-based basically came together. If we had maintained that difference, is that what it would take for this conversation not to be happening?
I haven't had time to calculate exactly how far I'm off on the skilled labor because I just got that report yesterday. But I can tell you that 5 years ago, I wasn't having trouble hiring elementary teachers. I am now. I started school year this year without a kindergarten teacher, without a third grade teacher, without a math teacher at the high school. I have subs in 2 of those positions. That used to not be a problem, but what's happening is that, you know, you may have read about this, but in Jordan, Utah, they infused $11.5 million last year in salaries. So where I'm losing my staff is to Utah and Denver, Salt Lake City and Denver, and other states too. I mean, I had some leave, went to Washington State, and these people were not the group that was leaving in the past. So I think what's happening is the market pressures are more real than what we see when we look at just 2 years ago. But on the skilled labor, I've never had the problem that I'm having this year with custodians in particular, and electricians and folks like that. And we're big enough that we have to have a master electrician. You just can't find them. And when they come, they just go right to the Trona mines. And, you know, new people out there start people at 70,000. I can't start a plumber at 70. I mean, it's what, 46 in the model or whatever. And so I have put, you know, the beauty of the model is we have to move money around. I did have to put elementary counselors in because the mental health issues that are coming up with kids has grown significantly in the last 5 years. That's one thing I can tell you that's way different. And the Department of Health will confirm that. And for some reason, it's with our younger children is where the biggest growth is, kindergartners. And so I can certainly get numbers for you like that, Chris. I finally just, you know, hired my own consultant to come in and say, I need to understand this because I am stuck. And they performed it and said, you're way off. That's why you can't hire anybody. And so I kind of knew that, but I needed to know how far off I was. And so I start carpenters at 2163, and I've got to start them at 32 in my area if I want to hire one. So, you know, when I multiply that up across the staff, it's going to be tough. I don't have it left.
Go ahead. Senator Wasserman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions to ask, and I'm not sure there's a right answer, but I have some education experts in front of me, so I'm going to ask these questions. And I've always been fascinated by Wyoming's special education and the fact that we fund it at 100%, and I've always been very proud of that. But I've always been concerned about our total percentage. And I noticed on the crew report that we at one point were at 14.3%, and we've gone down to 13.9%, which I think is outstanding. But my question is, but we also have an increase of 2.5% in cost. So our numbers have gone down, not significantly, but our inflationary cost has gone up. Can you explain that?
Yes, and the trend that we've been seeing with special education and Sweetwater too is that over the last 5 years, the biggest growth we've had in special education are children coming that are very high need students, and they're coming from surrounding states. And our total care, which means that they're in a bed all day and those kinds of things, that program has grown tremendously, and we have to have nurses in there and other staff because these children are, I mean, they're on respirators and other things like that. We have to have service in there. But there seems to be an influx of really expensive children, so to speak, in special education.
And Mr. Chairman, if I can do a follow-up, and I know that that is true because I have heard from my principals that BOCES has moved students to our school district. So thank you for that answer. But then I have another question that I don't have an explanation for. And I noticed in our crew report that our free and reduced lunch has increased from 2008, 34% to 40%, which I see as a substantial increase. Yes. But then our mobility rate has gone down. And I'm wondering what the reason is for that. Why are students moving away from schools dropping, and yet our free and reduced percentage going up? Is there an answer for that?
Do you want to
talk
No,
first?
go ahead.
I'm actually asking a question. I don't have the slightest idea what the answer is.
I don't have a specific answer, Mr. Wasserberger or Senator Wasserberger, but I do believe that with the reduction in the number of students across the state, that probably some of those students might be some of the more mobile students that we have. That would be a supposition and a guess. I don't have an actual answer for it, though.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions? Yes, Representative Landon.
Brown, Mr. Chairman.
Michael?
I just have a quick question. Can you tell me a little bit more about the study that you commissioned for the firm out of Oregon? Can you give me an idea of what, you've given me an idea of what it sparked it, but can you tell me a little bit more what it involved, what they were looking at, and why you commissioned it?
Yes, because I wanted to know why I commissioned it was because I needed to know the data for the current reality that I'm living. They're an HR firm. They're called the Trump firm out of Oregon. They were very reasonable and very good. They helped us last year. We had to take out some money out of our reserves and do a voluntary incentive plan reduction because I've had to reduce so much staff, and I tried to not send people out on the street with nothing. And that's what was my first experience with them, and they did such a phenomenal job. I asked them about market studies. Now, they did a market study on my directors. I had them do that last year, central office, and we're paid exactly the way we should be, right in the middle. They do a minimum and a median and a maximum range. And so now I've reduced a lot of staff, but the ones of us that are left were paid appropriately, not over, just right in the middle. But what I found, my teachers are still underpaid when they compare them to what's happening in Utah and Colorado, in other states. People are starting to infuse money to retain. I know Salt Lake City, their big, the governor has talked about that their big push there is to try to retain because they're losing people after 3 to 5 years, lots. So they took that into account, and then they looked, the skilled labor was pretty easy because we have such a plethora of data right there with the mines, and that's my competitor. And we're just way off. And so if we can get them at the school district, they stay until their name comes up on the list at the mines, and then they're gone. But I've never had the trouble I've had with custodians like I'm having this year. And so it's important to me that the schools are clean, and they have to come first. And so that's why we're cleaning our own building at Central.
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Follow up.
So you've worked with them twice. I'm just kind of curious. I'd like to see potentially something like this statewide, to look at this statewide. I recognize the implicit issues that you have in your area, but what did this type of a study cost your particular school district?
So altogether, I've paid $15,000.
Okay.
So it hasn't been too much. It's about $3,000 per group because they take a real detailed look at group like skilled laborers. And then they took a detailed look at, my directors and those kinds of things. So it was about $15,000. Their staff is so talented, and they get it back to you pretty quick, which is good. And then what I did was layered our staff on top of it, and I could figure out what the range was. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Further questions, comments from the committee? Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment. I see this handout that you prepared was provided by your attorneys. And I see that it's dated September 5th was probably, I'm guessing, when it was ready. In the future, if we could have a little bit more advanced time, I'd like to spend some time kind of studying this and reading this. And, I just can't quite do that here at the moment. So in the future, if we could get a little bit more advance on this, that would be great.
Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Ellis, thank you for that, and I'll have that discussion with the coalition. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions?
Could I address that real quick? I do believe that we did get that to your Attorney General, and our belief was that he would share that with you. So we didn't want to overstep his bounds until we got to the meeting. So, but we'll look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question I asked a couple of minutes ago of Donna, I'd be interested to hear the thoughts of the other superintendents in the coalition, and you know, how much would be enough? How far short are we right now in your view? Would a simple continuation of what we see as figure 1 in the monitoring report that we have, if we had maintained that differential between the evidence-based and the statutory model, would that suffice at this time? And we can start at the end with Mr. Deal.
Thank you, Chairman Northrop. Senator Rothfuss, I believe that would go a long way. Basically, what I just told you is I think we'll be funded at 4% under the estimates here by the 1920 school year. But yeah, I think that would go a long way. That would 4% is significant. I was looking as well at the crew data, and on page 28 of that report, it indicates that there were 78 fewer teachers employed in Wyoming than there were the year before, and this is in 2016-17. I believe if once the 2017-18 data is published, that decrease will even be greater. So we're talking greater than a 1% decrease in the number of teachers employed, while enrollments have really remained pretty static. The other.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We actually have that in the new crew report that was just presented to us, the draft. So when you look, this is page 11 of the crew report update slides that we saw today. The differential, or let's go to the actual FTE. The actual FTEs in 16-17 were 6153.9 funded, utilized, excuse me, and that went down to 5943. So there was a drop in FTEs hired on the books of a little over 200, where the model FTE was exactly stagnant. So I think the thought that you had there, we ended up losing 200 teachers over that time. And obviously we've complained a lot about ghost teachers over the years, and this has been a concern. But when I look at this, it seems to me that the reason we've been increasing dramatically recently hasn't been anything other than the fact that we've been making cuts, and we've been cutting deep enough that there's no way to not end up cutting teachers. Is that accurate in how you see it as well?
That is accurate. Not only have we been cutting, but we're seeing that we have a retention problem, especially with the younger teachers. They're in this climate, they're unwilling to buy a home. They look at other states. They're basically saying, I have very little experience. I feel like, I could be in the chopping block at any time. So we are seeing a retention issue as well as cutting.
Chairman Northrop, Senator Rothfuss, I've only been there for 2.5 months, so I'm going to give you a kind of an abbreviated look at that. Anecdotally, we still have a very difficult time getting people hired in special ed and some of the specialist areas. I would say at the elementary level, we're probably not as pressured, but we probably don't see as quality of applicants as we've seen in the past. And I'm going to ask you to kind of repeat some of the questions so I make sure I hit that.
Mr. Chairman, that was basically at the concept, first of all, of how are you able to recruit, which you hit, and then the other is you're saying that the ECA hasn't been sufficient. How much and a percentage would be wonderful, but I realize you don't have that off the top of your head, but how much more is needed before everything is fine? I think that's an important thing for us to understand.
Yeah, and I think the ECA is going to come back to exactly where are we at with the inflation. I think that we're probably about 13% low based on the legislative model, and that's kind of a rough guess. If we're looking at the convergence, then I think we're just below convergence at this point, and whether we're going to get back up to that and then continually add the ECA like we do with the regional cost on an annual year so that it's something that just happens. I know that we go through the process of setting the ECA every year, and we've gone to 4 different indices. We've kind of agreed that the utilities indice and the materials indices, we've kind of historically gone through and allowed them to move forward. And where we go through this monitoring process is on the professional side. And I would say since we are below where the legislative model is, we need to catch back up there and move forward with a steady indice to take care of professional and non-professional.
Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Rothfuss, thanks for that question. And I just want to say your instincts this morning were spot on, as well as your comments. I would tell you, without going into tremendous detail, we do have open positions. Special education is a big issue with regard to school psychologists, regular classroom positions, speech therapists. We are fully staffed for the first time in 5 years, and we had to provide a paid internship of $10,000 with the requirement you'll work with us for 1 year, but to get some internships to come to us in this past year or two. So that's how creative we had to get to just simply staff the needs of our students. And there's a cost obviously associated with that. I have a hard time throwing a number at you, Senator Rothfuss, as you might guess. I would like to say that I think, for me, there aren't 2 models. And this convergence theory, to me, is inappropriate. There's one model. It's the model that the legislature has passed, and it's required to be adjusted for inflation, period. It's a strategy to reduce costs. So a nod to those whose intentions were that. It has worked, as has the monitoring process of market labor, which Dr. Brown talked about. But there's one model, and it's the one you all chose to fund, and it's no longer cost-based. I find it interesting that we've visited all morning, and I don't think I've heard anything with regard to the last recalibration and the recommendations from APA. But there are some issues there, and I think Mrs. Little-Como's testimony hopefully impacts all of us. It does me. But there are challenges, and we're doing the best we can to maintain a great education for our kids. So thank you.
All right, one more question. Senator Roth.
For real. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The changes that we make are slow in terms of the impacts that they actually have on the students and your ability to teach in the state of Wyoming. So you look back 14 years ago, before I was in the legislature, when Senator Coe basically worked with the committee and said, all right, we're going to provide resources to the education community that are dramatically higher than what we are now, and we have an expectation that will provide results. And it took a while, but I think at that point in time, we were middle of the road in NAEP, and now I think we're all taking a lot of pride in the fact that our recent NAEP scores for the last 2 times they were released had us top 5 in the country in math and reading if you aggregate across all subjects. And as we know, I think number 1 in 4th grade mathematics. So it took a while, but that investment seems to have paid off. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are now if we're coming up short. We've gotten the system running very well, but now we've made some cuts. My concern is that we'll see sort of the same thing. It won't be an immediate effect, but we'll end up eroding the performance we have. What are your thoughts on how soon you would expect to see that? Are you already seeing that? Are we already having challenges that will end up leading to a lower quality of education? Are there any things that we can do in the near term to prevent that, other than just throwing money at it? But if throwing money at it's the right answer, then let us know that too.
Please.
Chairman Senator Rothfuss. Sorry, I called you Chris before, but.
I called you Donna.
You know, while I'm not sleeping at night, I have tried to make sure that my obligation to children stays as pristine as it can. And so that's why we're cleaning buildings, and I've tried to keep the staff. I am proud to say that the Y-top scores that came out yesterday, that our student scoring pattern, we scored better than the state 83% of the time. And that's grades 3 through 10. However, because I have taken some of the most important resources, as was spoke about in our last recalibration conversation, instructional facilitators are now gone. That's going to have an impact. I have a mathematics background. I like to do coaching directly with teachers. And I cannot do that this year because of all these other things I'm trying to manage. So I think that what you're going to see, Senator Rothfuss, is in about 2 years, I think you're going to start seeing a real tank in what kids do. We have worked so hard. And I think that's why I get so emotional about the fact that 83% of our scores are higher than the state average on the first results we get on our new state test. That's pretty remarkable because you tend to set the bar again. And I just worry about, the ground we're going to lose, and our obligation is children. That's it. That's how we're funded.
Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Rothfuss, I'll just add, in terms of impacts in Campbell County, one of my concerns, and we really tried to do what Donna's done, which is maintain the integrity of that teaching expertise and classroom instruction. We have made cuts that have impacted our highest performing kids as part of the cutting 50 FTEs and $5 million over the last 2.5 years. We've reduced our summer school enrichment program, which was targeted for kids that needed extended growth or we wanted to extend their learning. That is gone in our district. We have a GATE staff. We approach it differently than the PICUS model would suggest. So we do spend more than the model would provide in GATE, but we reduced our GATE staff by half last year. We also were fortunate to have library media specialists. We have reduced half of our elementary specialists who used to run one building. Now they share a building in our larger schools. And so those have had impacts, and I would agree with Donna. If this continues, it's coming in a couple of years. One other thing I would add, if I could, was a lot of good conversation about actual salaries. And I know it tends to bother all of us when we see a number of teachers, 500 and some that weren't hired. I would encourage everyone to look at model salaries. Actual salaries are important, and it's the districts that are doing that in order to compete. And I think it's really important that we look at the model salaries and ask yourself, should a starting teacher make $38,000, $39,000 a year? That's what is being funded. So the credit to that goes to districts in terms of actual pay and being competitive. It's the model that needs to be adjusted for inflation each and every time in order to maintain a cost basis. And it hasn't kept up. Thank you.
I'll ask you what your starting salary is in the district.
Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman Northrup, our salary is $48,000.
48.5.
Mike, can you help me? Starting base salary.
I think it's close to 48.
So approximately 48.
Thank you. Any other questions for you guys? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anybody else for public comment? I have a mic back. Hi, Brian.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association. Just a couple of quick comments. And I know most of you on the committee know this because you've been a part of these discussions for a long time. For those that are newer, I do just want to remind you the data that we've been looking at by and large is 2-year-old data, 2016 data. The reason for that is that in June of a given year, federal data sources such as the Office of Educational Statistics release their comparable data, and that's the most recent federal comparable data is 2016. So June of 18, we get 16, June of 19, we'll get 17. That lag is always a result of the availability of federal data. I think Superintendent Little-Como did a good job of stepping in for Paul Harvey and is helping us to understand the rest of the story. So what happens between 2016 and 2018, and it's incredibly relevant. The first thing I would encourage you to do is think about the very first comment that Dr. Stoddard made. When she was talking about her report, she said trends matter, and indeed trends do matter. What's happened since 2016 to 2018 is that Wyoming has made cuts in education. We've made substantial cuts to educational funding, yet our surrounding states have made efforts to move up in funding. As a matter of fact, we see some of that data in the National Education Association's data on estimates and rankings. We see that Idaho made the largest increase in teacher salaries, 3.6% increase in teacher salaries in Idaho, the largest in the nation, a neighboring state. We know that South Dakota initiated a half-penny sales tax directly benefiting teacher salaries. We know that Utah, we just heard about Utah making initiatives to raise teacher salaries. Our surrounding states since 2016 have been increasing their investment in education, while Wyoming has been decreasing its investment in education. It's just a part of that rest of the story, and it continues. The trends continue. Colorado is a little bit hamstrung with Tabor, but on the table in Colorado are numerous proposals to increase Colorado spending on education in this next legislative session. There's another thing that was discussed that I want to address, and that's this idea of hours worked, days worked, weeks worked by teachers or professional staff within schools. And I would suggest it's a faulty assumption to assume that there is a 40-hour work week, either by teachers or by administrators within a school system. Anybody who goes to a school, you go at nighttime, there's activities happening in our schools. There are administrators that are there supervising activities, teachers, coaches coaching activities, after school, before school. Teachers at home, people are working quite a bit, and there is one recent publication that suggests that it is closer to a 53-hour work week for that teacher than a 40-hour work week. So if we want to compare days or weeks, that's one thing, but hours may be a more accurate comparison of the variable workloads. Another comment that I would like to specifically address is with regard to transitions that are happening in our state, another trend that I think matters. This past year, we had 10 transitions in the superintendency in Wyoming. That's the first time in 5 years that we've had double-digit changes. So 1/5 of the superintendents in Wyoming changed in this last year. When we look at why is that, there were 2 retirements, 1 in-state transfer, 3 left the state for better salaries, and that's shocking. The 3 that left the state for better salaries left for substantially better salaries in other states. We lost 1 individual to North Dakota. That didn't used to happen. That's a tremendous challenge and change in what's happening in Wyoming. Wyoming School Boards Association does assist with a lot of these changes, and so we see the kind of applicants that are applying for superintendencies in Wyoming. And we don't see quite as many applicants in this past year as what we've seen in previous years. With teaching applications, I can tell you that we host on the WSBA website, we host a page that has teaching jobs in Wyoming. It's probably the only source that has kind of a comprehensive list. Not every district posts with us, but any district that wants to does post with us. And I'll tell you that on any given day, we have between 2,000 and 3,000 hits on that page. People know that teaching jobs in Wyoming are pretty good paying. So the initial interest is there, but once they look into it, you hear from the superintendents that they're not as interested as they used to be. Those are trends, those are changes. People still have that idea that Wyoming teaching jobs are good jobs. They look into the jobs, but by the time they look into them, they're not applying for them like they used to. Mr. Chairman, one last comment is that I would say that there are a couple of those trends that concern me when we think about the differences. The information you heard about principals is slightly alarming to me. When we think about the erosion of our purchasing power for for principals. Research suggests that good building leaders make a difference in student achievement. If we're not able to offer the salaries to bring in the people that we used to for principals, that term is alarming to me. When we look at the term of classified staff and we say classified staff is maybe closer to what it's paid in the work market, that's on a job-for-job basis. It does not consider that maybe a janitor in a school isn't going to be a janitor in a school because he can make more money driving a truck in a mine. That's not the same job comparison, but broadly, that's the reality on the ground. So I do just want to remind you that the reality is that there's a difference. The 2016 data we look at, the 2018 reality, we can fill it in with anecdotes. In a few places, we do have data. Mr. Chairman, you asked about salaries. On the Wyoming School Boards Association page, we have a list of starting salaries in districts. So you can go and you can find some of that data. But in the absence of hard data, I think we look at that comment of Dr. Stoddard. The trends matter. Sometimes the gap's widening, sometimes the gap's shrinking. Generally, those aren't good trends.
Question for Brian? Brown.
Quick one, Mr. Chairman. Brian, just real quickly, you mentioned that we had a couple superintendents leave for better salaries. And one of the things, as you mentioned, Paul Harvey, the rest of the story, those salaries, did they translate to a larger district, or was it a similar district, similar size, and they just received similar or a larger salary for doing similar responsibilities?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Landon, I don't, look at me do the same thing. Representative Brown, I don't have that exact data in front of me. I can tell you when I looked at it before, there were people leaving in one particular case for a bigger district, but if you compared that salary with a similar sized district in Wyoming, the disparity was still great. So yes, they went for an amazingly better salary, but if they had gone to the same size district in Wyoming, it would not have been the same salary that they received in another state. Wyoming is still below on the same sized district in that particular case.
Anybody else for public comment?
Dean Russell.
Welcome, Dean.
Thank you. I'd like to just add a few points of data for your consideration, Mr. Chair and members. Dean Ray Reitzel at the College of Education, University of Wyoming. I think it would be important for this group to understand the trends that are emerging in the supply line of teachers, which I haven't heard discussed yet today. If you look at national trends, and I will be testifying before this group in November, and I'll bring some data to substantiate what I'm saying today. The trends of enrollment in teacher education programs nationally are down 35%. Just let that number rest on you a minute.
A third of the people who used to choose to be teachers are now no longer choosing that profession. Now, we've held our own pretty well in Wyoming. We're only down 25% at the College of Education at the University of Wyoming. Now, think about what that does to the 45% of teachers you've been drawing for the state in the future. 25% less. And I think all of these data are looming data that point to a very severe teacher shortage in the future in the state of Wyoming if we don't start to address both ends of the tiger, the head and the tail. The input supply line needs to be addressed seriously, which I will be reporting about in my testimony in November. And we are taking steps at the university in our teacher education programs to address the front end of this problem. But I encourage you to think deeply about what these data are suggesting to us in terms of our own internal capacity to meet the demand of teaching in the state of Wyoming, and what we are still and have been relying upon outside the state of a very quickly shrinking teacher pool coming into the profession. Thank you.
Questions for Russell?
We just figured we'd hit it once.
There you go. Line them up.
Teresa Chalk, Superintendent, Lincoln 1.
Mike.
Teresa Chalk, Superintendent, Lincoln 1, Wyoming. Chairman, Co-Chairman, Northrop and Committee.
Hello, Chairman, fellow committee members. I'm Kelly McGovern. I'm the Superintendent in Rock Springs, Sweetwater 1.
Chairman, co-committee members. My name is Scott Duncan. I'm the business manager for Sweetwater 1.
Thanks for letting us have a minute to approach you. I appreciate Superintendent Como talking about the story in Sweetwater County, in particular Sweetwater number 2. I'd like to share for you realistically what that looks for us. We have some similar things to Sweetwater number 2, only being 15 miles away, but we also have some unique things that I really would like to share with you. Senator Rothfuss, you were asking about particulars on positions. What does that look like? A couple years ago, I was asked that question, and so for it. Usually, back in 14-15, if you had an elementary teaching position, there was a time where you would have roughly 100 candidates for that job. You were able to do selection for that. You could have teaching interviews, and you really had a good pool of candidates that you could choose from. Back in 16-17, I pulled the numbers for the same type of position, roughly 100 before it was down to 33. At the start of this school year, I had 10 positions that were open. They were unfilled. Of those 10, 4 of them were special ed. That doesn't count the positions that we went ahead and we just closed. So we had 4 special ed, 6 of those were regular ed, including secondary certifications in English and math, music, art, library, and then elementary ed positions. 0 candidates for those jobs. So we talk about special education efficiencies. How can we share across districts? I can truly tell you, I can't fill the positions in order to even meet the needs of our own district. We collapse special program students together with the teachers that we have. When I look back at our district on some of the things that we've done, we opened up a cost savings task force a few years ago, and that was really with our community members. We went to the stakeholders in Rock Springs and we asked them, you know, please help us. We have a budget deficit. How can we work together? What ideas do you have for what we can do? Here's some of the things that we have done over the last couple years. We have lost a total of 46 teaching and administrative positions. 46. We have closed a school. We have reboundaried those students. We have adjusted school start and end times so that bus routes are shorter, so that things are more efficient. We can't fill bus drivers. We cannot fill custodians. 0 applicants. Last Friday, we had 8 bus routes that had no driver for those. None. We have no applicants to interview. As I mentioned, we've closed schools. I share administrators between buildings. So in a couple of our schools, I have an administrator that's in one building in one of our alternative high schools for part of the day, and then he goes down to our junior high for another part of the day. Here's what it really looks like on a day-to-day. The most important things the administrators are doing is, number one, they are evaluating the teachers as required by statute. The second, they're keeping order in the buildings the best that they can. The mental health needs of our kids coming through. We talked about counselors. We need school psychologists. We can't fill them. There isn't a week that goes by that I do not receive a phone call from one of our building administrators that says we have a suicide threat on a student. They're making complaints about they're going to hurt another student. They're going to hurt the school. We've got to have resources for that to support those kids. It's not the same as when we entered this. It's not. It's not the same as 28 years ago when I came in. We've frozen our salaries. We're on our third year. The base salary for Sweetwater 1 is $46,565. I can't compete with Sweetwater 2. She's got the same kind of problems. We have not been able to move that base because we're not able to sustain it. I don't have intervention positions that I was able to have several years ago. That doesn't count the instructional facilitators. Those are gone. And the thing that I asked, we've done early retirement incentives. So you want to put a price tag to that. So we lost a couple years ago 25 certified teachers that walked out the door. They were able to retire. There was so much expertise. So now we have a younger staff. And so much is said for that because when they left, they did that to save jobs for the younger people coming in. But the price to pay for that is now we have to make sure they're training, their professional development, that they are ready to go with a population of kids that are very different. Last year, we had 38% in our district that was free and reduced. 38% of those kids were getting breakfast and lunch at our school. At the start of this year, a couple of weeks ago, we were only at 18%, and I'm very pleased to tell you that. But I can also say that the minute the snow falls, then you're going to start seeing where they don't have the right shoes to come in and they won't have the breakfast. Right now, the weather's nice enough where they want to stay outside. They'll be hungry, but they'll stay outside to be at recess. When it gets cold and their tummies are growling, that number's going to go right up. So before I turn that to Scott and Teresa here to the left of me, the thing that I do ask you, and I can see why Superintendent Como got very emotional, but I think you need to think about your grandkids. Think about your kids. We have no place else to cut. Thank you.
Sure, I just have a couple things to add to our story at Sweetwater 1. And we've also redesigned our health plan, so it's not only the salaries that we're looking at. We have some cost-saving measures for our health plan as well, which is not an easy thing to do. Another part of our story is that even though our district is losing ADMs, that we do have a trend, especially at our secondary schools, where the incoming classes force our junior high and our high school in the city of Rock Springs to be at or over capacity. So we're losing students at the elementary level, but we're at or over capacity at our secondary level. So that's a little bit of an unusual scenario, but it's also part of our story.
Senator Roth.
Thank you. So on the healthcare plans, just to clarify, we provide a distribution for the teachers that's basically at the state plan level. And what you're saying is you basically eroded that so that you'd be able to free up some funds to pay other bills. So you degraded the quality of your healthcare plan as a means of cost control.
Yes, that's a fair statement. Yes, we had a fairly low deductible plan for everybody, and we ended up offering 3 different plans at a much higher level deductible
including the high deductible health plans. And so that lower deductible plan has since gone away for our actives and also our retirees and replaced by those other three health plans.
Thank you.
Good question.
Good morning. I believe it's still morning. Just a little bit about my story in Lincoln One. We had 9 people leave last year that we tried to replace, and we do have 2, and you'll hear more about this tomorrow under special education, but the 2 we could not replace were special education teachers. And for, I'm going to guess, 9 years, I've needed a speech pathologist. A little bit of the story there is my speech pathologist that was there when I was hired 21 years ago. I would tease her and say, well, you can never leave. Well, she's never left, even though she retired. She's still paid to supervise our intern speech pathologist that is in her 6th year of school and will graduate this May. And then Nancy can finally leave. But we don't have a choice. We have to provide speech pathology. So it'll be 7 years before that position's filled. And of course, we've made her sign a contract to say that she'll stay at least 3 years. But, you know, both her children are going to be out of school next year. So will she stay after that, or will be in the same boat? I do not know. We haven't had an occupational therapist for 5 years. So we do contract with Dan Mayer Bosey's for that. But we get her 1 day a week, and we have to provide services with an OT para for the rest, which is fine, but it's not optimal. It's not what parents want for their children. And we even raised our salary to $48,000 to try to get applicants for the speech pathologist and the OT. And when we raised that, we did at least get applicants, but we didn't get any hires. We've raised our base over the last 8 years from 40 to 44,000. We still do not get applicants. We literally have to, we beg and plead and we got our English teacher because he applied to be a head football coach. He didn't care about it. It's like, well, in Wyoming, you're not really a head football coach. You're a teacher and a coach, and we got him. We do not get applicants, and it's not that much different today than it was 5 years ago. But 5 years ago, I might get 10 or 15 applicants for an elementary ed. Today, I might get 3 to 6, and most of those are because we're growing them in-house. They start as paras, they go to school, and they want to stay in Kimmer because their spouses work at the power plant, the mine, Williams or Exxon. They don't want to leave. We cannot hire great quality people. We do not. Ours leave to go to Sweetwater 1 and Sweetwater 2 and Lincoln 2. And I think the reason ours leave, and other small districts can attest to this, we burn them out. I mean, they teach 4 to 6 preps a day. They coach. And then on top of that, we'll say, hey, Chairman Northrop, do you mind also going to school so you can be duly endorsed to teach something else? We constantly burn them out in the small districts. And so I think that's important to note that you can't hire a part-time person. So we're going to hire this math teacher and say, oh, can you teach business? Can you teach social studies? Oh, maybe a piece of you could be sped. We burn them out. And that's something that took me about 10 years to realize, because I'm like, bring it on, we'll do it. But our teachers are burnt out. And we don't want burnt out people teaching our precious students, whether they're in 5th grade or 12th. And one other, I guess, point I'd like to make is if you can't get valid data on how many positions are open, then let us do it. I mean, I can call it 48 districts and get accurate data on that. I think that's not a very valid statement, that you cannot get valid information on that.
Questions, comments from the committee?
Mr. Chair, if I could, one final comment. When we talk about our teachers and the tasks that they're doing, the first year of the cuts, we lost 75 paraprofessionals in our district. And I represent the 4th largest district. And I'm really pleased on some of our Y-top scores that we do have. And when people ask how are we able to do that, our teachers are doing it. And they're doing it because our capital is human capital. It's those little ones that they see. That's what they're doing, but we're killing them off. Because where we're going to see it is not only the 0 candidates that I have on there, but that gap's going to get bigger. It's 10 this year. How many more are we going to have for next year? And it really worries me for that. So I thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
Other public
close public comment and.
Thank you. We'll close public comment and go to lunch and committee. We have an Analyst instructor here that would like to run through it real quick if you guys would like to stay for Alice instruction, and if not, we'll be back here at 1:15, at which time we're going to call an executive session to get counsel from our lawyers, and then hopefully we'll be right back out by 1:30, if that works.
You want to just let them come back at 1:30?
1:30 for the public.
1:30 for the public.
Yeah, the committee, if the committee'd be back here at 1:15, we're going to go into executive session to hear from Mr. O'Donnell on the ECA.